hopefully he will join us.
As in ledger?
Yes.
Just a couple extra pieces of paper. My iPad completely died.
iPad.
It cost you the election.
There you go. Right. Be careful.
It would have to serve 2 years.
Trust me, you don't want to do that.
Yeah, Jane will kill you.
Brian will kill you. All right, I'll call this meeting of the Executive Committee of the Society of Professional Journalists to order. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Patty Newberry, thank you especially for being here. We are going to conduct this meeting a little bit differently, which this is the third meeting over which I've presided, and all of them have been a little bit different from past meetings, where we are going to spend some of our collective time and use our collective talent and brain power to work on strategy and thinking, hopefully thinking the big thoughts and looking at the overall big picture. This is the result of an effort that Michael Kretsky put forward to us back. There's Robert, come on in, welcome. Michael had proposed a month or so ago, put out a plan to shrink the size of the SPJ board that I think was fully debated, prompted a lot of discussion. His plan was defeated, but I think the general sense of just about all of us in leadership is that these are actually issues that we need to be thinking about and taking a look at. And so Joe and I got talking, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to take a look at board governance. One of the things that grew out of those meetings is the need to have some kind of task force or group. I immediately thought of Patty Newberry as somebody who would be a very good leader for it. Lynn and I consulted on that because this is coming at the end of my term and will start and continue on through hers. So I wanted to make sure we were all on board, and we both thought Patty would be a wonderful choice. So we're pleased to have you join us.
Thank you.
And hopefully this meeting will help to give you some guidance, and it will help us figure out who we want to have on this task force, because there were several people that I asked to join who did volunteer. We're not going to kick them off, but we want them to continue to work. It was Andy, Becky Talent, and Alex Tarquinio were the three who expressed an interest. And there are other constituencies in SPJ that we need to make sure we cover, but I'm hoping we'll think of who those people might be as we continue our talks today. Because I hope we have a 30,000 foot view on what to do. Joe has been over the last year or two working on his CAE certification. I know Tara's been doing some professional education as well. And I think it is certainly to their personal benefit, but especially it's to our group benefit that two of our key staffers are getting this information, because it will redound to our benefit. They're getting some great stuff, and I know Joe had 5 memos for us that covered a lot of different things. And with that introduction, we'll get to the items that are on the agenda probably after lunch. We just have to move through a few things, and then we'll go into executive session to discuss and select our award recipients. But Joe, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you and let you run with it.
Great, thanks, Paul. Hopefully you all have had a chance to read the memos. But today really what I was hoping for was a discussion that we often have sitting around the bar. Good ideas, bad ideas, but the key being big picture ideas. So what I really want, and I'll reiterate it as we go through the day, everybody should be thinking about what do we want, not what is attainable. And it's a big difference between what we want and what's best for SPJ versus what does this organization think it could realistically get done. Let's leave the what can we realistically get done to the task force. Today, let's talk about what is best for SPJ, and that's the end goal. So I also think it's important to reiterate about what governance is and why it exists. Nobody joins an association because of its amazing governance structure. So the governance structure it's about creating an organizational environment that fosters better, more relevant, impactful, desirable association. You want to foster the environment to be the best that you can be. That's what good governance is about, and that's the goal. The goal is not creating a good governance structure just so we have one. The goal is to create a good governance structure that really propels this organization forward. So those are the things we're going to be talking about today. So I want to start with this analogy that in this book I've been reading. It's right here, Race for Relevance, and I have a copy for all of you, which I will give you at the end of this class session. Your homework. One of the analogies used in the book I thought really encapsulated the ideal setup for an association. And so if you'll picture a ship, and up in the crow's nest, there are people looking out on the horizon, and that is what a board should be. That is where your top leaders should be, in the crow's nest. And they're looking for rocks, and they're looking for icebergs, but they're also looking for faster currents. They're looking for uninhabited islands. They're looking for places to go. And they're shouting direction down to the person at the helm, which ideally is your executive director. So your executive director is steering the ship, taking direction from above. And in the bowels of the ship are your staff and your committees, and they are rowing. They are doing the work based on all of the information that's coming down to them. Too many times and too many hours our board spends rowing. This afternoon, you're going to spend the entire afternoon selecting award winners. That's a rowing function. That's not moving the organization forward. And that's what we do a lot of. So the goal is, can we rise above that? Can we create a group of visionary, strategic people? And how do we do that? Because that's what you really need to propel the association forward. So that's the analogy I want you to keep in mind. Are we in the crow's nest? Are we at the helm, trying to steer the ship? Or is that the executive director's role? Or are we rowing? And if we're rowing, we need to get out of there, because that's what not great associations don't do that. So that's the goal. So a quick background on the association landscape. I know Bill asked a question about what are some, the best associations that are out there. So I sent a note to the woman who wrote this book, Mary. She and I have been in communication, and she basically said there is no perfect association out there that does everything well. Associations do bits and pieces of it well. So she turned me on to this study. The Harvard Law School Corporate Governance and Nonprofit Study has identified 6 key responsibilities of a well-governed nonprofit. And this is all going to sound very academic for a few minutes. Formulate key strategic goals and set necessary policies to achieve them. Oversee matters critical to organizational health. Evaluate and help manage risk. Steward the resources of the organization for the long run. Authorize major transactions, and mentor senior management by providing resources, advice, and feedback. And so ASAE did a survey of 1,300 board members across the country, and the vast majority said that they're not very good at any of those. What they are good at, as this survey showed, are 990s, making sure the minutes are kept and taken appropriately. The management stuff, the CEO evaluation, that's what boards gave themselves high marks on and said, we are very successful at these things. The visionary stuff, most boards and associations think they don't do a very good job. So this is an academic way of saying we are not alone. Most associations strive to be more strategic than what they really are. Few associations take the steps to make it happen. So that's what this meeting is about. Can we take the steps? So like I said, most boards lean toward tactics. I think it's what they feel best doing. In many cases, it's what they know. But we need to really work to rise above that. So 2 things to remember before we get going. Let's focus on what we think is best for SPJ, not what we can get done. Let's try not to get bogged down in that. And the reason for good governance is not about good governance. It's so that we can be a better, more bold, more nimble, better association that provides more relevance to the journalism community. So with that said, I think we should probably start with any questions that anyone might have about the memos that are in the book. And then after that, we're going to kind of just start brainstorming and sharing and crying on each other's shoulders about the frustrations we've shared with our board. And I do think the memos, they hit on several topics. They hit on board culture, they hit on board makeup. We talked about the delegate system. Patty's task force specifically was charged with looking at board makeup. So I think that's probably where we should focus most of our attention today. But I do think it's important that it's kept in mind with the holistic vision of SPJ's governance. So with that said, any questions, comments about the memos before we jump in a little deeper?
I'm sure there's discussion before we jump in a little deeper, but why 5 in the memo says that that's like the ideal board number. And could you maybe just explain again why 5? That seems like a very small number for a national organization to have directing the ship.
Right. The premise behind that number is it's really just looking at what do most associations, how do they operate anyway? And in the vast majority of associations, regardless of the size of the board, there's an executive committee. And most of the time, the average number of people on that executive committee is 5. So the premise is if executive committees in most associations are doing most of the work anyway, which happens in other places, not quite as much SPJ today, although that was the case 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago. If 5 or 6 people are making the majority of the decisions for an association anyway, why not just let them do it? So that's where 5 came from. She also says that she realizes 5 is not the perfect number for everyone. But for this discussion and for the purposes of how we need to think about SPJ, I think we need to start at 5 in the extreme and see, is 5 too little? What voices aren't represented with 5 people, right? So now let's work our way up from 5 to get to what we think should be the right number, as opposed to starting from 23 and paring it down. Because I think if you start at 23 and pare it down, you're not going to go nearly as far as you can. I think if you start with 5 and work your way up, you're going to end up with a better, more manageable number. And that smaller board concept, again, it's not just making a board smaller for smaller sake. There's 2 main reasons to do it. And I think this is important to keep in mind as we're talking about board size. The goal is to have a board that you can have the most visual people, the people who, the CEOs, the people who look at the 30,000 foot level and can do it really well. If you're trying to find 23 of those type of people in your association versus 9 versus 7, you're gonna have a much, much, much tougher time. Secondly, trying to keep a good, strong board culture among 7 or 9 people is much, much easier than 23 or 25. So that's the reason that board size is important, not just for the sake of board size.
And in these other organizations, which I have my last question, these other organizations, the officers, they're all essentially at large. They're the 5, 7, whatever their board members. And in general, obviously every organization has their own thing. But in your research, you found that most of these organizations and even other journalism organizations, they have essentially an at-large board.
Many do. The most successful do.
Okay.
The ones that find it easier to find the visionaries have a non-representative board. There are no shortage of associations that even start today that still go with the representative model. But with each criteria and restriction you put on a potential board member, it makes it harder to find people when you start eliminating them because, for example, if you're putting together a baseball team and you have to pull one person from each region, you might get 9 catchers, right? But what if you have 3 all-star pitchers from New York? You're only going to allow 1 on your team. That's kind of the idea, is getting the best minds possible, regardless of any representative model that may exist.
Are we talking just SPJ board at this point, not SDX board?
Correct. That will be something that Robert and his group can decide if they want to address later. Although I will be honest and tell you, the more I think about this, I kind of envision a day where I wonder how great it would be if each board were, I don't know, I haven't put a number on it yet, but let's just say 9. If each board were 9 and once a year the boards met collectively and had an overarching strategic meeting and then kind of divided and conquered based on responsibilities. I've thought about that, but this is just about SPJ.
You say in your memo on page 8, when talking about board size, think back to SPJ's board strategic work in New Orleans. Would it have been more effective with fewer people? Could we have agreed quicker? Could we have drilled down further? Did the large group present more great ideas or simply produce more to wade through? I'd be interested in hearing what people think about that question.
Well, I think that was essentially, that was a lot of brainstorming. That Scottsdale and New Orleans, those were brainstorming sessions. And in brainstorming sessions, I think the more ideas, the more people, the better, because you're brainstorming, you're throwing ideas up, and well, a group has this energy of doing it. I mean, can it be done with a small group? Sure, But if you really want the largest collection of ideas, you want a slightly larger number. I think the process in that Scottsdale and New Orleans, both of which involved, decent number of people, like 20 some people, was, I mean, my view of it was pretty fantastic. There was a lot of great ideas that came out of that. I mean, could that same process have been done or been as effective with a smaller group? I don't know. But the group that I was part of both groups, the Scottsdale group and the New Orleans group, and I thought both were effective. I mean, again, I don't know if they could have been as effective had it been half the size, but I know the size they were effective, in my view.
I think though too that the group in Scottsdale, when we got to being part of both of those, when we got to New Orleans, it was a time to revisit everything again. We had some buy-in, some not some buy-in from people on the full board. So I think we took a step back a little bit in New Orleans because we could have taken what we did in Scottsdale and advanced that. That group was smart enough, good enough, and should have been trusted enough to take that idea and move it forward versus having to explain it all again and then try to convince some who weren't that excited about doing it. It kind of exemplifies what I see a lot of, and that is we get on the road and we see where we're going, and then we start taking little side trails because someone wants to take us on a side trail. And that's what I got from your memo was that we have to trust the people who we trust. We don't, then we need different people doing it.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just gonna say something along those very lines, and I think when we get to the discussion of board culture, we need to come back to that point because I think there is a lot that is a lack of trust in leaders, and it goes back to if you look around here, there are 7 of us on the executive committee. That's not so many more than 5, and I know organizations that I've been a member of, been in the leadership of, and organizations that I have covered as a journalist. There typically is an executive committee that acts by itself and has the authority to move everything forward.
And this executive committee once had.
Yeah, I know this executive committee once had that, and then there was, within, I don't know, the last 10 years or so, there has been, as you put it, I think, turning the executive committee into a task force, which I think was an apt way to describe it, including the work we're going to do this afternoon. In selecting the awards, we have to go consult with the board and get the board's approval for that. So I do wonder, as we go forward, the role of an executive committee, whether it's the 5 officers or the 5 officers plus 2, which is what we have now, two representatives of the board on exec, vis-a-vis the entire board, and how the interplay of that is. Do you want to have that? Do you want to have a single board that's 9 or 15 or whatever? I think those are questions.
The idea behind the much smaller board is that there is no executive committee.
Okay, so I figured.
It's a group of leaders. Now, ironically, what will happen is if you get too many numbers, right? You go to 11, 13, 15, you get up to 17. Now all of a sudden there's a need perhaps to have a smaller body within that body to do the day-to-day business. That and the research shows it's not efficient. You now have created 2 layers of governance
Right.
within one body.
Right.
So the idea is to have one board, no executive committee.
Gotcha.
The board is the board.
The board's board.
Lynn and then Sue.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as far as like New Orleans versus Scottsdale, I felt the group in Scottsdale, that the number of people there didn't bother me. I thought it was, since it was the first time we were talking about it, it was kind of good to have that many people, and it was not just board members. I think that was key. I don't know that board members needed to be as involved with that. I think it was actually better that it maybe had more people that were not board members. In New Orleans, I thought it was entirely too many people in on that conversation. We could have done the same thing. I mean, yes, there were great ideas, but when you went to one of those pieces of paper, there was so much repetition. And there are other ways, I think, to bring people's voices to the table than to just have everyone there sharing them. I mean, as a board member, that's kind of our role, right? Before something happens, to kind of reach out, especially right now, the way the regional director, reach out to your chapters, your chapter leaders, and kind of survey, and then you kind of are that voice, and you don't necessarily need to have people there participating like that. So.
That was exactly where I was going to go. That's exactly what I was going to say. That in a restructured system, again, I guess I would advocate strongly that we do more to dig in from the grassroots level, bring it up to a streamlined type of board situation, make certain that'll put more work on the lower level, but that's where it needs to be. In my estimation, it engages your membership more, one would hope. It engages the leadership, it spreads it out. Again, we can talk models later, but I absolutely agree with Lynn. I think you do your work at the lower level, bring it up, and then you have your decision making.
One of the things, back to just to put a cap on the Scottsdale versus New Orleans discussion, it's worth remembering the group that was in Scottsdale grew out of the executive committee. It was the executive committee plus. And we put a fair bit of thought into building who that group would be to make sure that there were all kinds of voices around the table. We didn't get everybody we wanted necessarily. We sure had a lot of different people, including non-board members. And that's one of the, what was it, competency-based leadership. You have specific people. I know one of the groups I have followed is the Virginia State Bar, and they have spots. They have appointed spots on their executive committee so that they can make sure that they have certain minorities covered, that they have women, because the elections almost, it's a male-dominated profession, and you have an awful lot of men who run for the representative seats. So they make sure that all those voices are represented and heard. And we don't have any mechanism for that. It's really catch as catch can. And in our nominating, our candidate nominating, our candidate vetting selection process, those factors don't always come into play. It's like, who can we get to even run? Which is a problem in and of itself, and goes back to, again, the regional nature of how we're structured. So, Bill.
Robert, I believe you've read the various histories of SPJ, probably
Memorize them
more than the rest of us have. How did we get where we are today? Is it a matter of what communications was like in 1909? Or,
why it was created the way it
yeah,
is?
why do we have a 23-member board?
Well, it started out as a smaller board, obviously. It grew as the organization grew. Region 12 was added something in the 60s, I think, which is why it's stuck in between 8 and 7 and 3.
That looks funky.
The at-large positions were added after the revolt of the 70s. At one time, it was the publishers and editors who served on the board, and they tapped their friends, the publishers and editors, to replace them. There were nominating committees, not just at the national level, but at the regional level, the idea to keep editors and publishers in charge and use directors, the people in the corner offices. And sometime in the late 70s, there started to be more people running from the floor. Tended to be reporter types, writer types. And by the mid 80s, it was about a half and half board. Clearly from there on, it became it swung the other direction. The at-large positions were created were to create a spot for executive types who didn't want to, deal with the, getting their hands dirty running a region. And obviously, I don't think it ever actually, any of the folks it was intended for ever actually served in it.
Yeah, my understanding was they were hoping to get Walter Cronkite or somebody like that.
Yeah, something like that. I think,
Star
yeah.
power.
And it just became, more of the same. Student representation, I think, I mean, that, it was started out as a student organization, so there'll always been student representation. So, yeah, I mean, I think it kind of evolved with the time and for what made sense then. If I can make parenthetically, I'm glad that you all voted down the proposal in your meeting. That was a battle of 2003. You don't need to fight that battle. You got a new battle to fight. And this is what you're moving on to, and I'm glad to see this.
I think a success that we've had using the, let's have committees do the work and send us and we'll make the final decision, is today's awards process. In every case, Abby was able to beat the committees into submission and make sure they gave us their recommendations and they did the vetting. So we didn't have to do the vetting. We could then just evaluate what they had recommended to us. And I thought that made I didn't have to wonder, was this guy really as good as his CV says he is? They had answered that question for me. And I thought that was a nice, successful template for us.
It's a good way. Yeah, that is the way it's supposed to work, I think, ultimately.
I'll take it a step further. If the FOI committee is going to vet all these people, why not let the FOI committee choose the winners? Ethics, same thing, right? So you start thinking about all of the time that board, and now what we've gotten into, I was telling Joe last night, is a situation where, so it's been easier and the ethics committee will choose who the winners are, but essentially what you are now doing is vetting for the full board. So these awards are now going through a committee, the executive committee, and the full board to pick an award that is most likely will be whatever the FOI committee recommended 9 times out of 10. So that's a perfect example of when we talk about rowing versus watching.
Rowing in place.
Yes, or backwards sometimes, right?
Now the
right?
guy's on the left pole.
Yeah, right.
And I do think it's important to understand, Bill, you asked where we came from and how we got there. And it's, in 1900, you couldn't form nationally very easily. So everything at that day and age was grassroots. We haven't evolved too much. But I also think the thing that's a challenge for SPJ is our farm system, right? And so our farm system is different than the national organization in that our farm system is our chapters a lot of times. When you're on the chapter of a local group and you're on the board of a local chapter, much like small associations, which SPJ is not, you work. Like you have to work because nobody else is going to do it. So what happens is you have people coming up through the chapter ranks who are used to working, and they're good workers and they work their tail off. So when these people rise to the national board, the inclination is, what are we going to do? I need to work. I'm going to work. We need a large board to get the work done. And it's really hard, I think, for people coming from the chapter structure who come up through the chapter ranks to understand we don't want them to work. We want them to think. We want them to see. We want them to visualize. But that's not what we're training in SPJ's farm system. So it's that, I think, shift that's really hard. And very few people, I think, do it well, can say, I did all the work, now I'm done, now I'm just going to give you my ideas and thoughts and wash my hands. And then you take it a step further, which we actually require our RDs to work.
Yeah,
So
I've not been to Scripps, but
Yeah.
that's what Scripps teaches them to do, work.
It teaches them how to lead, but when you're at the chapter level, rarely, I think, do chapters talk about their vision and their future. I think they talk about how they're going to get their awards done, how they're going to get their events planned, how they're going to manage their programming. And many small associations have to operate that way because they don't have a staff. Much like our chapters, most chapters don't have a staff. So the only way the work gets done is by the volunteers. But there comes a point in time during an evolution, if you grow big enough, where that's why you have staff. That's why you have committees. They should be the workers, not the board. The board should be the visionaries in the larger associations. And flipping that switch, very hard. Almost impossible, I think.
And please correct me if I misread or misunderstood this. Under this sort of proposed, like a smaller board structure where we would no longer have regional directors who would be in charge of regional conferences, the regional conferences could either go by the wayside or be run by the chapters, which essentially they kind of are now. I mean, a regional director kind of makes sure that everything gets done, but the chapters are the ones that are essentially, booking the locations, getting the speakers, because it's in that place. I know New York is kind of going through that right now. And I mean, the Region 1 director, Jane, is, giving advice and making sure that, okay, you've done this and that and that, and now you need to do this, you know, but it's the chapter leaders are doing that work.
Mhm.
So, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, there may be a need within the organization to have a point person in a regional area that can kind of like help chapters decide, but maybe not. And maybe if the chapters can decide among themselves and the spring conferences are taken care of, maybe we only need somebody to help us find judges. But that person doesn't need to be, and usually is not, a visionary on the board determining where SPJ National is going. And so that's the difference. I don't think that those roles necessarily have to go away. The idea is that those roles aren't necessarily filled by people who are supposed to be the association's visionaries.
And you emphasize too, you could do spring conference if you want to.
Mhm.
You don't have to.
That's the way it is now.
I mean, in our place in Region 6, we have to because it's other organizations. We have Minnesota AP awards. I mean, we want to. It serves a lot of purposes. But some, I mean, as I watch them, they do regional, they do spring conferences, and sometimes they don't work out well because they have to do it, and they do it begrudgingly, and it takes up a lot of time and a lot of effort that really isn't necessary.
I could argue in a region or a chapter would be more successful and would not burn out their volunteers if they did 3 smaller programs over the course of the year as opposed to one giant spring conference and still reach the same amount of people. I think.
Yeah, I'm looking at the big picture thing. I just throwing ideas out there, and this I realize is probably for a deeper discussion later. But I kind of like thinking. I was looking at our regions and how the big coverage area. Then I kind of looked at what RTDNA does in a way of their regions. They have more, but their structure is entirely different. And my thoughts are, you actually increase the region, so you diminish the amount of work for a regional director. But they also have state directors in each state who reports to a regional director. And keeping in mind that our regional directors now have a representative, they have a self-elected person. That person on a rotating basis, again, throwing out an idea, could have a slot on a board, which automatically downsizes your board to begin with. It represents those interests from the bottom up. It gets more people, again, engaged who are closer and lead closest to the people involved. Just one possible idea, but it's also, it downsizes automatically your board by a substantial number, almost in half. It ensures that there's representation there. I would also advocate on behalf of students. I don't know how many boards have students who make up a huge chunk of the membership. Their interests are very different in some respects than the professionals. And I would maintain that there needs to be some kind of, again, a dedicated slot, whatever we do, to make certain that there is representation there. But again, you have to look at the variety of things. And I just thought that's kind of a neat way to combat the problem of these vast regions that we have to cover. Engage more people. You do the work at that level, and then it flows up so that, and back down with the big picture. Just something.
Robert, you want to make a point?
There were just a couple of things. I mean, building up to Rebecca and Sue's comments, I mean, nothing says that you can't continue to have a regional structure. Indeed, I think. I may break your rule for just a minute and talk about what's possible. I think for whatever you decide, there has to be, to pass, because this is going to have to go to the delegates to pass. To pass, there has to be an acknowledgement, of the region. I mean, that's what I intend was the feedback you got was concerns about how it would affect the most recent proposal, how it would affect regional operations. So I think there has to be, you have to keep something that involves the regions. Perhaps I can make the conclusion that one of these people would have a spot on the board, and it could rotate. It can be it could be chosen from them, like the current regional caucus chooses a leader, and that keeps that. The other thought that I had, as you look at the overall structure, I like it. As I read Joe's memos and thought about this, I couldn't help but contrast the SPJ board with the SDX board. The SDX board is even larger than the SPJ board. It's not exactly nimble, but I'm not sure that a foundation board should be too nimble. It has a different purpose. It's not membership. We don't have members, so there's no members voting for representation. every, other than the officers and the at-large directors, everybody on the SPJ board is elected by a parochial interest. Whether it's regional director, student member, whatever. The SPJ board is essentially composed of three groups. There's those old farts. There are the SPJ representatives. And then there are the folks who are in neither of those camps who are more or less selected because they fill a need that isn't taken care of by the other ones. Bill Ketter, Sonia Roth, Evelyn Sue. And I'm not sure that wouldn't be, to me, the number on the board is not a terrible, whatever the number is isn't terribly important. Other than that it's a number that allows for efficiency and for the nimbleness that the SPJ board does need to have, and for a culture that keeps focused on strategy. But I think going for some sort of of a structure that pulls from different groups, not so much to represent groups, but to fill the needs of what you have, a regional representative, some sort of a campus representative, as long as that campus representative isn't too parochially, just promoting students and campuses and not keeping the strategy. Maybe there's a spot for our partners. I think that would be a very controversial thing to do, but a seat for RTDNA or a seat for various folks. Some folks elected at large, some number, 7, 6, 5, whatever, elected by the membership, and whoever gets the 5th, 5, 6 most number of votes, and that's where you really put the effort into. And maybe you leave a couple of slots that say, the board is going to pick a couple more members to join this because we don't have diversity, we don't have long time experience, we don't have somebody who really understands new technology, whatever the role. Just completely open. It would be almost be like what a at-large could be under the current structure, but it's something where you can recognize the holes in the board membership and actively go out to fill them. Just an idea to toss out.
So because you brought up the proposal and the concerns with Kerensky's cutting the board and kind of the regional reconfiguration, the concerns that those people had were all based around the way it has always been. So how will I get to my regional conference? How are people in California going to represent my interests in Texas? We feel differently about these things. Just for a second, pretend we never had regions. If those people went to a Journey camp in their city, or a chapter hosted a 2-day program because they had the bandwidth and the volunteers to do so, and they came to national conference, those people would still get the same things that they got previously, just without the region, because they didn't know that it ever existed, but they're getting the same things. So I think that's a fair point that their concerns are there, but I do think for a little bit, sometimes backing up and realizing that they can still get those things without those regional boundaries.
That's kind of what I was going to say. I think, we're focusing so much on like what we have now. I would rather us look at like, what don't we have and what's in place that's like preventing us from having what we want. And I really, I know I have people that have wanted to serve that ask me about serving on this board and want to, but they live in regions that maybe there's not a race open. They move a lot. The reality of these jobs it's not the same where people stay in one place for 10 years. It just isn't happening. So they can't serve on. We've lost, since I've been on the board, I think 2 or 3 board members because they've moved.
Tony Hernandez was the latest one.
Yeah. And so when we do that, we are limiting our options so much. And yes, I get that chapters are important. They were very, very important. They're becoming less and less attractive to members. They just are. Look at, we have 40 with that. We always talk about the 41% that are not represented by these chapters, and some that probably choose not to be. And there are so many other organizations. Like, think about the people who aren't involved in SPJ, which are a lot of my journalism friends, because the chapters are not appealing to them. They want something at a more national level. They want to be a part of something that's sort of bigger and not based on a chapter meeting or, it seems so old to them. So if we want to sort of remain relevant, we're going to have to kind of think differently and make those changes.
I don't disagree with the idea that if chapters go away. I still think because of the one-on-one contact, and again, this is minutia that can be worked out in the task
Right.
force. But I think if chapters went away, that's not the worst thing in the world. But I still think because of the size of the organization, at least at this point, hopefully we'll have some growth in it, that you still need some slower level contact rather than potentially run the risk of everything getting funneled into headquarters. Which I think, again, it gets more people engaged. That's the thing.
Yeah.
To build your leadership base, you need to engage the people. And in order to get them engaged, you give them some role to play. So if you had a state director, and again, on the board representation, there would be ideally just one representation.
Let's talk about the board representation, because one of the memos I laid out was the representative model versus a competency-based model. And so in the discussion already this morning, I've heard, Sue said we need to have a place for a student, and Robert's suggestion was having one space for a RD that represents all. At its core, those are still representative models, right? So let's talk about why is it important that SPJ have a representative model, and why is it important that it moves away from a representative model. So if you had to pick one, you only get to pick one, and you had to either go all in on a representative model where voices were represented at the table, or a competency-based model where the people on your board are elected based on their ability to lead the organization, and you can only pick one, which do you choose? Who would go for a representative model?
Is there no hybrid?
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
say for now there's not. If you only could pick one, which would you rather have?
Tell me more about the competency model.
So the
Is
competency
that up to the nominating chair?
it would be up to the organization, which then would give the nominations committee, ideally, group of people. These are the types of people we want to lead our association. So you determine the criteria. So it could be, somebody who, of course, you want a visionary. You want people who can lead. You want people who can see or have experience maybe in their day jobs at that higher level, some of them anyway. Entrepreneurial types, people who can see what's not today. It's important to have those types of people on your board. And maybe you can tie job titles to them or not. But the criteria is developed so that the people leading your association aren't elected because they represent a constituency. They're elected because they would be a good leader. I don't know if that helps you.
But who determines that?
It'd be the association. What type of people do we want leading our association?
If the association, all 7,000, 6,500, whatever members can't do that.
Nope, that's up to the leadership.
So it's not the association deciding, it's the leadership.
It's the leaders
deciding.
elected
Yeah,
by the
yeah.
members.
Which takes us back to the original model where buddies could pick their buddies to run, that then brought the result that brought
Now that doesn't,
working stuff.
a competency-based model of nominations committee doesn't mean that somebody's handpicking who gets to be on the slate necessarily. It could be the nominations committee role could be this is the job description. We are looking for these types of people to lead these associations. And so it's the job description that they put together. And then anyone can run, right? And maybe the nominations committee makes a recommendation, or editorial boards do that, but maybe not. The nominations committee doesn't have to be people picking the individuals to run for office. The nominations committee could be the ones setting the criteria for the types of people we're looking for. Then tell the membership, this is what we think is important for upcoming leaders. Here's the slate of candidates, vote. But it could work that way. But how it works, who determines the qualifications, that's all up to this association and the elected leaders to figure out. That would be your job. If it was your job today, you would have to determine what types of people do we want leading this association.
The closest I can think we've come to that is when we picked Joe to be executive director. We said, here's a job description, here's the kind of person we want. And then we got some applicants, and some of them didn't come anywhere near close to what we said in the job description, but they still applied, and in an election, someone like that could win. Somebody who had, just because they were popular.
Yeah, or you end up having kind of a vetting committee. That would be one of the functions of the nominations committee, perhaps. And that's one model of this, of where they make recommendations. And again, who that would be, goes back to your point, Robert, who's really choosing all this? It's at one point Joe made, none of these systems is perfect. They all have their downsides. I mean, I don't know that I'd ever read the buddy or heard about the buddiness of the past system. You know, it's
So
like
we're
the
going,
pen,
you're going back 40 to 50 years. basically.
yeah, well, the pendulum has swung.
Yeah.
And now, you know, it wouldn't be bad if we had some of those folks. I mean, think of, you know, we don't have any real industry leaders involved in SPJ the way that they were back in the 60s and 70s. You know, I do remember reading the part about the fight for FOIA and shield laws and all that. The old SDX guys were in the state houses, and they were the ones whose voices meant something. And they got those laws passed, and that's one of the great things the society has done over the years. But back to Joe's question, you know, which model do people think?
And there's no wrong answer, and I
Yeah.
promise you there'll be a payoff in a few minutes. So, show of hands, who thinks SPJ would be better served by a representative model over competency based? Who believes competency based is more important for SPJ than representative? So what you're saying, those who voted for competency based, or if you voted representative based, right? What you're saying is either the ability to lead is more important for SPJ than representative, or the voice of the constituent is more important than qualified leaders.
Oh, I like the hybrid.
I like the hybrid.
I don't disagree that the hybrid would probably be ideal. I haven't found where it works.
Representative does not guarantee incompetence.
Nope.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it does, it's limiting though. I mean, it's very, very limiting. I mean,
Yeah.
this being on the board, I mean, even in this position and working full time, it's very, very hard. And it's why I think we don't have a lot of people who do step up because they see how much work it is. We work very, very hard. And I'm not saying board members shouldn't do things, but I don't think they should be doing the things that the busy work that we are doing.
The rowing.
Yes, the rowing. We shouldn't be. That's not what our roles are. And because of that, I don't think we get some of these newsroom leaders. We're not getting people from some of these foundations. We're not getting any of those voices because it is a lot of rowing and it's not the bigger thinking. We should be networking, making connections. We should be sort of furthering causes, not, you know, vetting awards and doing those kind of things. Not only awards, but like the 41% task force, that should not have been board members, I don't think. That should have been members kind of working that out.
I think the thing to understand is it's incredibly unlikely leadership of this association would ever feel completely comfortable doing away with all concepts of representation. Right? I think that's the way to go, personally.
I agree.
And maybe that's the goal we strive for, right? I'm not sure that leadership will even think that's best for SPJ, and that's ultimately what this group has to do. This board has to determine what is best for SPJ. And if Patty's task force determines there has to be some sort of representative model, then the goal is eliminate as many representative barriers as possible. So maybe we go from a regional director model to a job title model, and maybe we have 3 spots that are based on representation, but the other, whatever we end up with, 11, 9, 7 are totally open and at large. So I think it's important, the lesson here, the important thing is the more representative concepts you have, the more restrictions you create, the more hurdles you create. The goal is to eliminate as many hurdles as possible. Completely, totally, all at large, competency based, 1 member, 1 vote, that is complete and total competency based. If you can't completely get there, it would be good to get as close as possible.
I didn't raise my hand on either of you because, like Sue, I am going to go with the hybrid. But I do. If any hybrid has, to me, it needs to be like 3/4 competency, 1/4 representation.
Leaders first, representative second.
I think thought to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about some representation, limited, is that do you run the risk of, okay, but this group's not represented and but this group is allowed to be, like, why can this, and maybe not, and maybe that's how we got to where we are today. I don't know, but I'm sitting here listening and understanding the desire for the hybrid. It also feels like a good compromise. I get that. I'm trying to think further down the road than what we develop in the next couple of years.
If I can just speak up, I mean, I've been around in excess of 35 years for this organization. When I joined, well more than 35 years.
You were 10 when you joined, right?
I was very young. But when I became a member as a broadcast student, and then I became a leader with the Maryland Pro Chapter and on up, and they heard I was in broadcast. Well, what are you doing in SDX at the time? my representation did not exist. And so I pushed hard in many ways. And so now that is a given. Look at the number of broadcast folks who have, who have become engaged in the program. The multi-platform folks, we don't even designate ourselves that much anymore as broadcaster print. We're a multi-platform. We do everything. But there are other special groups. If we hadn't had that representation, I really felt like a weird individual when I first belonged and I was in leadership. And when I first when I first got on the board, the same thing. What are you doing here? I'm sorry, but that's what I do. So I think to your point, Chris, it is, but I think it's also necessary. That's why I like a hybrid. I believe in the big thinking that helps to set direction. And that course will change throughout, any given year, multiple times. But there are the folks, I still believe we wouldn't gotten the broadcast folks involved. They're still, I think, not as great in number, but I think we have a pretty strong representation.
We do have majority on the executive committee.
Which is just entirely weird.
I
in that
was going to
respect.
say, I'm looking around the table and I'm thinking,
Come
you
a long
won.
way.
Let me ask this question, and then Lynn, and then Tara. So if it's different voices and perspectives you want at leadership, could it be the role of the nominations committee to seek and find a diverse group of candidate slates to fill that spots without having specific positions on your board that say you will represent this? Does that achieve the hybrid that you're talking about?
Yep.
That's, yeah.
But it's not a representative model. But that's the role of the nominations committee, is
Yes.
to find those.
Be aware of it.
Yeah,
Be aware of, you want minorities,
It
you
can be
want
written in.
students,
I
you
mean, it
want.
can be written into the processes of a nomination committee of what the slate should look like in general.
And that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. That's my thinking, yeah.
So IRE is very interesting because when I've been involved, actively involved in, I think maybe 5 or 6 years, not that long, but there was maybe one broadcast person on it when I started. Now they are the majority of the board. I think they just took over. That didn't happen because they designated specific people to serve. They didn't say, we need a broadcast person, we need this. It happened because the people in IRE, the broadcast people, were like, wait, we don't have any representation. We have one person. We need to get more people on the board. So what did they do? They sort of literally have banded together. I get emails from this core broadcast group, and they email blast as all the broadcast people they know that are in IRE. They do this, members, no one on the board, to say, look, we have these 4 broadcast people, vote for these 4 people. We want more broadcast representation. So yes, I think we want people represented, but I guess I've seen it that if the members want it, there's a way for them to do that and get that representation there. And like I said, with IRE, it's worked. They now have more people that are broadcast than are print or, kind of other nonprofits. So I just think that it's interesting as we talk about this, that was all member driven. Didn't have any kind of specific things that were written out that we need this, we need that. So it can also happen organically, and you still have the best sort of more the best quality, I guess, over quantity or specific representatives.
One of the things that has always helped and hurt us, I think, is that we're so broad. And so with all of the other journals and organizations, they're speaking to those niche things for broadcasters. They're speaking to students. They're speaking to all of these needs. So while I agree that each type of group needs to be represented, I do think we can't get to a place where we feel like we have to be in a position to uniquely bring that to a board level every year, because then what you've done is saddled your nominations committee with requirements of a representative board. So that's just one thing.
No, and I don't think that disputes anything that we've said here. I think, Tara, what we're saying is if you draw up what it is, the criteria that you're looking for, that would be among the things that you need to take into consideration to make certain that among other diverse representatives, this is a part of it as well. And that is all we could ever ask for.
So I don't think you or I are saying that there ought to be a broadcast seat
No,
and
not
an
at all.
online seat and
No.
education seat.
Especially now certainly with the younger generation, basically doing everything. They have a
For
pretty,
generation 2.
and
it's-
we're doing it.
You have to
we're
have all the
doing it too,
skills.
yeah. But this is second nature to them. They're used to things that an older professional might not be as familiar with. And so I think in and of itself, it will automatically change and maybe ultimately become a moot point, which I would be hopeful that that would happen.
So it's a really tough challenge for associations when you start talking about board makeup, because they feel like, and often we want our board to reflect who our organization is. And when people look at our board on our website, we want them to be able to say, oh, this is what SPJ is about, right? Like that's what they want. So in some instances, or associations view their board as a mirror. They want the association members to be able to look into the mirror and see, this is me, I belong. So it's very important to have those people. But I would also ask you this. If we were having a conversation right now about student benefits, do we feel like we could get student input on those benefits without having a student sitting in this room?
Yes.
Right. So when you have smaller competency-based boards, there are mechanisms set up to make sure that the voices are represented when those items are being discussed. There is opportunity for membership to give direct feedback to leadership. So I agree that it's important to have a board that people can see themselves in sometimes, but I also think that's when you kind of get hung up in trying to have everyone there. And then now you're back to another quagmire. So it's that delicate balance, I think, that the good associations figure out how to maintain and manage.
You know, it occurs to me that in the old days, committees were made up of one representative from each region. You know, the FOI committee had 1 through 12, and the ethics committee had 1 through 12. And we moved away from that. We moved towards a competency. You know, who's really interested in ethics? Who really understands FOIA?
Right.
So we've experimented with it and it worked.
One of the things this book talks about, which hopefully you'll all read, is restructuring your committees to go along with the board. And really what it says is working hand in hand, empowering your committees to do the work that the board used to, finding those experts, and calling on them and leaning on them when you need them, when you're making decisions or talking about the future direction of your association. So it does talk about having that stronger committee and staff model, where you empower your committees, you empower your staff, and that allows the people in the crow's nest to focus on what's ahead, not what's beneath them right then. So let's talk about any other questions or any comments before we move on. No. So we've decided, and we'll take a break at about 10:30 or so. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah,
Cool.
that'd be great.
So the majority, I think, has agreed that I think everyone has agreed, regardless of what the makeup looks like, qualified leaders trump representative people, right? We want the best leaders regardless of where they are and who they are. So who are those people? Not names. What types of people do we want leading SPJ? Like, throw out some adjectives. Any adjective. No adjective is
Engaged and
bad.
involved.
That's helpful.
Passionate.
Passionate.
Informed.
Informed is important.
Forward thinking.
Forward thinking is important.
Visionary.
Visionary. Strategic, I would say.
Sensitive.
Sensitive.
Need to,
I think good listeners.
Aware.
Aware.
I'd say like engaged with the industry.
Yeah.
That's really
That's the,
important.
that's
Yeah.
really engagement.
Industry expertise.
Industry leadership.
That could be good. Do you want a board full of CEOs representing SPJ?
No.
Right.
That ain't happening anyhow.
No. No.
But I think prominent individuals do add something if they're all those other things as well. Help us continue to grow our profile in the world, which I think has expanded quite a bit in the last couple of years.
I agree, but too many boards that I've seen who engage those folks are simply names on a piece of paper.
Well, that's why they'd have to also be informed, good listeners, engaged.
I can only hope that they follow
And we
through.
will make them in a petri dish.
I-
Because we're not sure they really exist.
I think it's going to take a while to build on that, but I think, yes, it helps for our stature, it helps for our growth, it helps for that visionary thing.
Yeah.
So those are the, I'll say, for the most part, those are personality traits you're looking for, right? Good listeners are good listeners because some, I guess, have trained themselves to be better listeners, but good listeners are good listeners. visionaries are visionaries. It's hard to find personality traits to a job description. You know, I've been hiring for 20 years, and a lot of people look good on paper, and I have no interest in talking to them after I meet them, right? So personality traits are hard to come by and hard to find. So the age-old model is the best mark of future success is past success. So the people who've done it in the past are more likely to do it again in the future. Yeah, a good track record of doing these things.
Yep.
So I think one of the key things for the task force, in my opinion, but then I want to talk about this, is how do we find these people within our association who have a track record of doing these
Well,
things?
Sorry, this is something I really feel passionate about. The track record, and I'm thinking of younger folks who are out of school, the entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are a little harder to put your finger on in establishing a track record, but some of them are visionary.
Mhm.
Some of them are some of your best and growing leaders. So track record is critical,
Mhm.
but I think sort of the entrepreneurial, I don't even know how I'd characterize it, but I think that is something that also needs to be taken into consideration, especially when you're evaluating it on track record.
Totally agree. I don't think track record has to mean a large CV. I think track
That's-
record means this person, when they were in high school, did this. They've tried this. They've tried and failed miserably at these six things, but they never stop. Like, to me, that's a track record, regardless if they're 16, 18, or 50. So I do think the idea of what a track record should consist of, like what are the types of things we're looking for, we shouldn't get hung up on a resume or a CV all the time. So, but if they're in our ranks, how do we find them?
How do we get them? If they're not in our ranks?
Yeah.
I think is a more important question, because you go back to all these. Robert, the point you made about industry leaders really hit a nerve, I think, with me anyway. Getting those kinds of folks involved in SPJ is going to be raising the profile of the organization, raising the relevance and importance of the organization. I do think one of the things we didn't mention, but I would add it to your list, is business awareness, because we are in a profession/industry that is in total transition from different models of, for years, newspapers ruled the roost, and newspapers are hurting. But I've seen, and I do believe, the articles that say we're in actually a golden age of journalism. You've never had more outlets. You've never had more opportunity to produce and publish good stories and to have good storytelling.
The Iraq oil report.
Yeah.
We've never heard of that.
Yeah. So the stuff that we saw last night is case in point. The other thing that comes to mind is the whole nonprofit model of journalism, which has been growing and is going to be a significant part. We don't have any penetration of that area at all, and that's one of the growth industries within the industry, if you will. I've been to, over the course of this year, I've been to, I think 3 or 4 regional conferences, and at every single one, there was some mention or some representative from these nonprofits. The guy down in New Orleans that we gave a big LDF.
The lens.
Yeah, the lens. Case in point. That they're doing great work. The guys from Kentucky, Patty, who were at in Cincinnati.
Center for Investigative Reporting is announced.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's something we really ought to be, just as an aside, totally, something we ought to be taking a look at, because I think as part of our board strategizing and makeup is we've got to be aware of what's the currents that are happening within the profession as well.
So there's two ways to get these types of people on the board, right? Let's just say high profile, for lack of a better word. You can ask them and say, hey, would you like to become involved in SPJ and sit on our national board? Or you grow them. What is most likely for SPJ? What is going to be most successful? To having visionary leaders who are engaged with SPJ, informed, passionate, some of the adjectives that were thrown out earlier. I think it's far less likely to find those traits in somebody that we ask. I think it's far more likely that you get those traits with somebody who has grown through SPJ. And if those opportunities to serve are, and the barriers are removed, does SPJ increase its chances of having those types of people rise through the ranks because they don't have to plan spring conferences or MOEs, or they don't have to represent a certain constituency? Does that improve the chances of getting those types of people? I actually believe that those people are in our ranks. For me, it's just a simple numbers game. We have 7,000 members. We have these types of people within SPJ. We just may not know who they are, and they may not have any interest in rising up because of whatever various reasons. And this doesn't even take into account the real reasons: job, family. Those hurdles are enough. We can control those, right? We can control the ones we can control. So I do think they're there. I don't think they either have the interest, time, or inclination to rise up, or we put too many barriers on them. Combination of both, perhaps. That's my opinion.
Well,
I don't know.
I think we've had some of those folks have served and are serving on the board.
Mhm.
And generally, they're folks who, like Lynn, you're not going to remember this conversation, but back in the old days.
The old days.
Back in the old days. No, back in the old days when we had that.
How old?
No, I'm talking like 4 years ago. When we had when we had those elitist, parties after the banquet. I remember talking with you on the balcony of whoever the president was, and I didn't say it, but I was thinking to myself, this woman is going to be president someday. I mean, you had all the avenues there, but you skipped all that regional stuff. You
Because I
skipped
didn't
all.
want to do it.
Well,
I'm
you-
very honest.
I mean,
Very
that
honest.
proves you were smart. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's to your point is for so many folks, it's the natural way to learn the board is through a regional director position, but that's putting emphasis on the work and not on the strategy. I mean, folks like Lynn, like Hagit, I'm trying to think of who else came directly through the treasurer.
Me.
I mean,
Yeah, Paul?
yeah.
Yeah, if you look at it, of the last couple of presidents, there have been as many who haven't come through the board as who have. Coolier never was on the board.
Yeah. FOI chair.
He was FOI chair.
Yeah.
I was
Which is work, but it's also passion.
Yeah, I was a state president and a committee member. I mean, there are like 3 different paths that you can do it. Lynn was a chair of Gen J and a committee member.
A passion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Dana came all the way through the board.
Right.
Rebecca's been on the board.
Yeah.
Alex has been
both
on
his
the board.
RDs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alex has been at large, right?
Hagit
I
was
think
not
you
a
want-
regional director.
No, she was.
No,
she
Hagit was not.
directly
That's
the-
right.
I think you'd want both. I mean, I don't know if you would want just homegrown. You want to be able to look outside. You want
Outside.
people who don't know the culture and say, what the hell's going on with that culture? I think
That's
you-
the reaction, I have to say, as I'm sure you feel the same way, if you come onto the board and it's a WTF moment of, this is, I'm not interested in this, I guess is the reaction I had when the first time I was on the board was after I was elected secretary treasurer. It's like, I'm really not interested in this. I want to get stuff done. I want to move the ball forward, think the big thoughts.
I mean, it's almost easier to tell people now, what do you get from SPJ than what do you do on a board? Well, we fight and then we come up with things. And then we kiss and make up and then we,
Sometimes.
Right. So if you think back, and in the memo about board culture, and we're not going to drill down on that too much today. I talk about some of my failings as an executive director in helping the president keep leadership at the higher strategic level. But if you think back to the agendas before New Orleans, and you remember the first time you opened up the agenda, and you're all on the board, how many of you looked at that agenda and said, "There's one thing on here I care about"? Or hopefully one, right?
No, there was.
Right. So 1 or 2 things on the agenda you might feel passionate about, right? So then what ends up happening as you're in the meeting and you're going through the agenda is you pay closer attention to the items you care about and you're passionate about. The rest, discussions happen while you're in the room and you're not engaged, you're not involved, you don't care much. You vote to support somebody because everybody else is. You don't feel strongly for or against. No board should ever be making decisions and voting on something because you don't care much, right? Because that's a lack of engagement. So the fact that when you start looking, and that's rowing, that most of those items are rowing. Somebody has a specific thing they want to talk about, a specific project they're working on, they want to present it to the board. Those sorts of things are rowing, right? That's what that is. So when you think back about the past agendas and you look through and you say, oh, well, there's been 2 things on here I really care about, that's not healthy. It's not healthy for the best associations. Everybody should be rowing in the same direction all the time, engaged, working. And what's interesting, but not surprising, those people who have environments like that, they deem their board experience, their association experience much better. They rate it higher. They feel like they've had success. They feel like they've contributed, and they're far more likely to stay engaged in other ways much longer than people who come on our board, retire now to the foundation board. If they do,
Old parts.
yeah, if they do, right? But how many of them do we not hear from much anymore? How many of them aren't engaged in other ways much? Because our culture is once you become president, if you don't go to the foundation board, that's the pinnacle, and you become maybe less involved with your local chapter. You don't want to get involved in committees. You don't want to be that voice in the room because you already had your turn. But these are the people who were the most committed. Like when Lynn's term's over, she will have figured out a way to be president and still not do any of the garbage that she didn't want to do, right?
Boy.
She's unique.
You're my hero.
Right. She's unique in that regard, that she figured out a path and was willing to figure out a path to get to where she wanted to go, despite all the barriers that we create. And that's not common. But those who are engaged in those regular, meaningful, forward-thinking conversations have a higher level of board satisfaction, which when you're engaged, and we teach this in scripts, she can do her whole spiel right now. When people work together, enjoy working together, have success together, it creates the engine of success, and they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. And we teach that for our chapters, and we don't do it at the national level.
Well, the other thing is that, and this is a side point, getting people to run for the ladder has been a problem over, I don't know, who knows how many years, but we don't have contested elections. Your election was the first contested one in, I don't know how many years.
2004.
For
When Brewer challenged.
for secretary treasurer?
Oh, no, when Brewer challenged.
Secretary treasurer.
No, it was Ensler.
Oh,
and
it was
Alvarado.
president-elect.
Sonny and John.
That's Sonny and John.
Back in what, 11, something
Yeah.
like that. But before that, it's just there aren't many. And what does that say about, again, finding somebody who's the visionary, the strategic thinker, who wants to lead the organization, because that's essentially what you're doing. Yeah, it's a commitment. It's a 4-year commitment, and you have to juggle it with life and family and all that kind of stuff. But
All right. The idea about the contested elections, I've been thinking a lot about that too. And our history has been, and all the nominations chairs, you can talk to Dana and Sonny, and I remember John saying this in executive committee meeting when we were in DC, is that our people are too damn nice. Because when they find out somebody else is already running for that seat, they don't. They let their friends have it, they let their peer have it, I'll do it later. And really what that's saying is I don't care enough about it to campaign. I don't care enough about being elected leader, but I will serve if you need me to, right? And that is common among representative models. But in a more at-large, concept, let's look at that. That's the race that we do have candidates applying for every year. Like Bill's had to actually campaign, like to keep his seat.
Yes.
I know, right? And the student reps, same deal. There's any student can do it. Now you still have to be a student, so there's that one representative barrier, but there's no others, and those are regularly contested. So what if there was a model, your board makeup was, again, I don't know, 9 at-large seats, and you want, not that you would have all 9 turn every year, but for the sake of discussion, you're looking for 9 people to fill 9 seats. And so who wants them? So now the mindset is you're not running against a peer, you're not running against your friend, you're not running against somebody, you're running for a seat. Maybe your friend gets one too. So now I think this barrier, this niceness that we have, this issue that we have had over the course of at least recent history, I think that dynamic changes a little bit. And so now I think maybe you increase your chances of getting those types of people to fill the seats because they are more likely to run. And you couple that with removing the work. Now what do we have? I'd be curious, I don't know, but I'd be curious to see if, I would suspect we would have a lot more involvement.
So let's stay with that possibility.
Sure.
Let's say it's 9, right? And that we've have a nomination committee and they've done great, and we end up with, I don't know, 50 candidates.
Yeah.
And we just have a wealth of possibilities. Would those people come in as a candidate for something, or would they come in as a candidate for the board, and then after that the positions would be determined among themselves?
Robert and I talked about this yesterday.
Yeah.
I can tell you what other groups do. I think this, again, like everything else, this leadership, this association has to decide what's best for them. I'll use ONA and IRE as examples because I know them. ONA does not elect a president. They don't elect officers. They elect the board. The board then chooses who the officers are. And the foundation actually does it this way, but it's a little different because foundation's board's not selected by membership. But in a lot of associations who have competency-based models, the officers are selected by the people on the board. So what if we went that route, SPJ would not elect a president. So that, I think, in many respects is the smartest way, because the people, you hope, who are chosen to lead the board are the people who are the most skilled at leading a board. Can members determine that, or will members pick their president based on a resume, or will they pick it based on something else? So I think the theory is there's more confidence that the board can choose their own leader, and if the board chooses their own leader, they are obliged to follow. They are obliged to get on board and be on the team because we've elected this person to lead us. Whereas if membership elects the president and then the rest of the at-large, if there's conflict between board members and president, now your culture starts to get a little rocky.
So,
But I'm not saying I'm not saying SPJ shouldn't elect the president. I'm saying a lot of associations select their own officers.
so in that, so the membership chooses the board, and the board chooses the officers. So if somebody wants to be an officer, they have to apply to the board?
If they're on the board, they would say, like as in the foundation, I'll just use that as an example because we kind of know it. The board would say, I'm on the board. I have an interest in running for secretary treasurer, or I have an interest in being president. So the people who are elected to the board would nominate themselves or be nominated by somebody else to fill a certain role.
That's how you get on the executive committee now.
Okay.
If you're the at-large person on the executive committee,
That's true.
you conspire with Radsky, and I nominated him, he nominated me, and here we are.
So it's already happening. That's so like IRE, how they their conference was just a week ago. So the board, everyone votes, then they find out like the last day of the conference, everyone who's on the board, you find out votes are tallied. Then they meet, and then that's when they vote, like the board meets, the new board. Then they as a group decide like who's going to be the president, and that's when it's kind of decided, I guess. Like,
Okay.
it wouldn't have to be that way here, but that is how.
I would presume that they have staggered terms, so
Yes.
for continuity purposes.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's necessary. Most also have term limits, but not all.
So if you're elected president, does that change on an annual basis? Every year you elect a new
I
president?
think IRE changes
Do
it
they every year?
Yeah.
It would make sense if your
Yeah.
term, let's just say, is a 2-year term, you could serve as president.
And then you just go back to be a flunky for
If
the
you're-
second year.
If you're reelected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, to the board.
I think you'd find people forming slates if you had 50 candidates for 9 slots. You'd find 5 people want to get together and say,
Yeah.
we want to
Yeah.
move
Oh, that
Philadelphia.
I mean, that's exactly what happened. Like I was saying with the IRE thing, someone organized sort of a push to all the members and said, here's our broadcast slate, elect them all. And that's literally, that's what they did, and it worked. I mean,
Yeah.
but I mean, that happens now though. I mean, think
Yeah.
about
I
the
do
chapters
think-
get together and sort of vote along a certain lines and that kind of thing.
Real quick, and then Rebecca and then Paul. I do think that this is really in the weeds and not something to be talked too much about today, but I think along with this idea of electing its own officers and who's the president and what's the purpose of leadership and what they're focusing on, there does come a little bit of I think some research and looking into what are the roles, traditional roles of board members. So, and I'll use the most obvious example is when the president is elected, she or he is the spokesperson of the association. Like they are the spokesperson. If your goal is to have a competency-based board that is really working to drive the association forward, and you elect a president who's really good at managing culture and running meetings and getting everybody on board and going forward, but is potentially awful face of your association in terms of speaking, does that change? Does the president still be the spokesperson, or do we delegate somebody else for a year, or does it become a staff position? Do we have a volunteer full time who's a spokesperson? I think there's 1,000 different ways to solve it, But I do think we have to keep in the back of our minds to remember the roles may also change. And we may want the roles to change in order to have a better governing body.
Each president handles the spokesperson in a different way.
That's what I
And,
was just gonna say.
you know, we've got the chairman of the ethics committee in the last couple of cycles have been designated to speak on that
Yeah,
issue.
I mean,
and-
it's the people who I have designated to speak on behalf of SPJ have been me, Len, Andrew, when it's Jonathan Anderson when he was FOI chair before he failed. I
Cool
think
year sometimes,
Coolier, absolutely. Yeah, we have.
based on competency.
No, I mean, Dave is, as long as he's willing to do it, is a wonderful spokesperson for us.
Small question, which is giant. Would, all of this would require a brand new bylaws,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
I mean, that comes at later, but it have to be,
That's a-
the task force
That's
doesn't have
better
to do that
stuff.
part, right?
No,
Task
you're
force,
just
We're
the
just gonna have
thinkers.
Yeah.
a line item that says, new bylaws
Do it.
will be required.
Yes.
Just do it and then they
Yeah.
figure it out.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
I envision, I do think that's something we have to kind of come to a conclusion at the end of the morning is, you know,
What are my marching orders here?
Correct.
Yeah.
and
That's
and
the goal.
and who's on that, and what types of voices, what types of people do we want on this task force, and what, you know, how do we want that to work? I do think that's incredibly important because, you know, otherwise the task force is just floundering. I view the task force's role as like identifying the hurdles, determining ways over those hurdles, ways to remove those hurdles, ways around those hurdles, but also, you know, hearing from people and what are the concerns of people. And I think a good representation on the task force will deliver that. You know, what are the concerns of, you know, chapter folks. And I think it's important, really important that we have non-chapter people. I would try to find somebody to put on that task force. And I was thinking of some of the ambassadors who stepped up recently to have the SPJ after hours, somebody we don't even know.
Yeah.
Put them on that task force to try to help figure this out. So I think the task force's role to me is identifying the hurdles, identifying the barriers, taking what we've talked about today, and ultimately deciding, we as a task force, given all the information we now have, think this is the best direction for the association, and here's some ways on how we get there.
A set of recommendations.
Yeah.
I think ultimately that's what we're looking for from you and your group, Patty, is like vet all these ideas. And, you know, I think the constant tension, and you identified it very first off, Joe, is what do we want? What can we get? What can we actually achieve? Because the gorilla in the room is the fact that, yeah, the convention has to buy this. They have to be willing to say, if we overhaul the delegate system, they have to be willing to say, okay, we're putting ourselves out of a job. And there will be, you pointed out, it will take a number of years.
And this is the reason I wanted to talk about what today, what do we want? Because the task force will ultimately figure out what is achievable. But if we start with what is achievable, we will not go as far as to get as to what we want.
Mhm.
We just won't. So
Should we also be discussing when do we want it?
I think
I mean,
later.
Somebody did, you just said for years, and
Yeah, this
that-
is not, this is
that
not.
shows
an-
we're not very nimble.
No, and Patty, this is not a multi-year task and
No.
an appointment by
The-
any means.
And I do think it's important to point out the strategy of how these things are achieved, they come after the decision of the board says, this is the direction we're gonna go. Then we start making it happen. So the task force, I don't think would be charged with making it happen. That's gonna be an organization-wide thing.
Oh, yeah.
With staff probably heavily
Well,
involved.
how long will Patty's committee have?
Why don't we delay that question till later this morning?
Agreed.
I mean, that's a good, valid question. I don't think we're ready to answer it yet,
Okay, so
but we are ready for
For
a
a
break,
break.
are we not?
Yeah.
10:34, sorry. Yeah, let's take a break and come back at about 10:45 and we'll pick it up.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, bathroom keys are on the counter, is that right, Chris? Bathroom is down the hall. All right, so we've talked pretty high level up to this point about kind of what are some ideals or what are some good things for us, and I think where we want to kind of go to now, because is somewhere where we ultimately as a board don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but we're going to go there today. So we're going to talk some details, I think, in an effort to kind of help Patty and the task force get a really good jump start on some specifics and some things to consider. So I would say that in the grand scheme of how smart associations operate, this isn't quite as high level as we normally would be, but it's also not completely rowing. I would say it's kind of somewhere in the middle, kind of same place I would put the New Orleans discussion with the board, kind of somewhere in the middle. Not quite
Strolling
there.
the poop deck.
Yeah, good point. Strolling the poop deck. So we talked, and I think the group came to the conclusion that we need to have a wide number of voices represented on the board, but it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to specific seats on a board. So incompetency ranked higher than representation on the board. And so the things we talked about is like, how do we find these people? How do we get these people? So I thought what we could do is drill down a little bit on how do we find them? How do we fill board seats with these types of people? And what does the association need to do to make their service, well, to get them to serve, I guess is the question. How do we get them to have an interest in serving? So I have, I don't know, 6 bullet points here that I can tell you that I came up with, or we can just start brainstorming what this association needs to do to get those people on the board.
Why don't you start
Yeah,
with your point?
fun to
Okay, and maybe we hit one. Maybe let's do this. I'll read what mine is, and then maybe we'll drill down for a few seconds on like what are some of these things and how can we remove them. And so the first one I have is remove barriers to serve. Remove the work, remove the barriers. So what are some of the barriers that we currently have if you want to be a member of our national board?
You have to do all the regional stuff.
RD work.
RD work.
Yeah.
Or geography based. I mean, like I said, if somebody moves, you lose your position because if you move from one area of the country to the other.
So remove the geography barrier.
Job based, because we have the education, you have to be
Remove the
Like
job
professor,
title
yeah, job
descriptions.
title,
Yeah.
Be willing to travel and make the meetings.
Right.
Yep. Travel's a big one. I think we don't talk about that a whole lot.
Employers who friendly to it, yeah.
Yep, employer friendly. What are some other barriers? Why do we think people don't serve? I think that's always important. Just why we think people
Financial
don't serve.
is one of the things that we've heard. There's been a recurring theme of that been hearing this year. It's like people either, even though we have stipends for RDs, it's not enough.
No.
But
Especially if
ideally,
you're self-employed, as in Dana's case, where her income, I'm certain took a hit because
She had her best year ever. The year she was
okay.
president, believe it or not.
Remove that from the record.
No.
However,
No, she told me
Yeah.
that.
if I was a freelancer, that would be a big.
but with
Common
a
sense says-
smaller board, it frees up more money, so that should become a non-issue, ideally. I mean, that's what
Sonny
you
said
want to be
it
able
was
to do.
not an issue the year he was the nominee, but I guess Dana's hearing that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I know Tom Johnson.
I think
raised
it
as an
varies
issue.
from year to year, depends on who gets elected, and let's face it,
And what their employer,
bingo changes in a heartbeat. One boss may say you can have the time, and they move up or out, and then you're screwed, basically.
I had within the years I was on the ladder, I went from a management that was very supportive and even financially supportive of my SPJ work group, an interim group that was hostile to it, to a current group that's supportive again. So that's what my
That's-
Right.
Yeah,
Time could be another barrier.
Time.
Time's gonna be.
yeah.
I think that's a good one.
Question about time. Do people simply not have the time, or are people struggling to give up the time?
I think
Oh.
I think it's that they think, okay, well, when you talk about what do you do with the board, we talk about, oh, there are phone calls, there are lots of these kind of meetings, there are lots of emails. That kind of time, people do not want to make time for, I think.
Yeah.
If the people that I think we're thinking that maybe aren't representative of the board, that maybe we want to be on the board, that type of sort of busy work sometimes that we have, some of those calls that can be very lengthy, and again, the rowing. If we eliminate those though, that kind of stuff, and the board isn't doing that would go away. But it's going to take time to get there.
Well, I think the other thing that comes up with time is like whenever newspapers do their surveys and people say, well, I don't have time to read the newspaper. It's not that they don't have time to read the newspaper. The newspaper is not worth their time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
enough relevant in it to give it the time. And I think that's part of what this discussion is. If service on the board is meaningful and relevant to what somebody wants, they'll find the time. If not, then yeah, they don't have the time.
So one quick comment, and then Bob had a comment. So O&A is an example of like, I think they do a lot of things right, but this one I'm like, I don't know. So they actually have monthly board calls every month scheduled. They get on the call. And what it is it's an opportunity for the executive. Now, Jane doesn't send weekly reports to the board. So that's their opportunity each month to say, okay, leadership, here's where we are on the strategic stuff that we discussed back in January. And then board members can ask questions and then bring anything up and then they're off. So it's not a long call, but they have a regularly scheduled monthly board call. And they have it whether or not there's a lot to discuss or a lot to update. Right. So it's like, here's an example of an association that does a lot of things right, but, and maybe that's right for them. I'm not saying it's not. But now when it comes down to the stuff you're talking about, should we, how do we manage that? And I think that's a cultural thing as much as it is anything else. Bob?
Yeah, whether the president is elected by the membership or by the board, it has become a big problem, I think, financially and workload wise to be president. Because it used to be that employers would provide support in addition to making the person who's president have time to do it. When Hagit did it, she was responsible for the same workload at her station, or she was going to lose her job. So providing support for the person to be president, whoever is president, is, I think, essential at this point to make people willing to put in that time.
So it's kind of like the RDs, right? It's the expectations of the job description of the president as it's traditionally been.
Well, or president as the person who is overseeing this organization and being on call to speak, to get people to do things when necessary and put out fires.
Right.
You need support to do that.
Maybe that's a reason to eliminate the ladder, because as Paul pointed out, your employer could change over the 4 years you're on the ladder.
Right, but I'm saying, but the position of president, I think, has, it's sort, regardless of how it happens, it's a workload that, in addition to keeping your job, or for Dana, who was a freelancer, being able to earn money.
You probably had to negotiate that when you went to San Diego, didn't you? You knew what the deal was going to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I was very clear because I was looking for a job while I was secretary treasurer.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And I was very clear with employers, this is something I'm doing, this is something that's important to me, will you be supportive? That was an interview, like when I was interviewing, I was sort of asking them that, so, yeah. And they are, so.
Back to,
Did you interview other places? I wonder what the others.
They all said they were, but I mean, you never know till you're there. They are here, so.
back, Bill, you made a point. Patty and I were talking when we went down to get something to drink. The ladder actually is a valuable training tool. It's just one, the train of thought, I understand what you're saying. But, with the three, it's a 4-year commitment. The first year you figure out what you're doing. The second year, you really know more. You're closer to your time, and you kind of be figuring out what you want to do. And the president's giving you this and that, so that you want to have a transition among the group. And by the time you're president, the first day you take office, time is ticking against you. And then past president, you do what you want. But one of the things that we ought to consider, and I know Patty's already given this some thought, that she was telling me, have assigned tasks for the officers, the 2 officers on their way to the presidency. Like, have one that's in charge of committees or overseeing committees. We kind of have the secretary treasurer ostensibly is in charge of the budget or overseeing the budget, that you have to learn the financial ins and outs first. And I thought that was a good thing to do. In actuality, it's been pretty hit or miss, hadn't it, Joe? Some secretary treasurers are more engaged than others.
I always leave it up to them how involved they want to be.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one way to enhance the rise up the ladder, and it would help the organization overall.
Except that presumes that we will maintain the whole ladder structure.
Understand?
Yeah.
No, I'm saying, yeah.
That's a
That's
big
the question,
question
yeah.
that the task force is
Yeah.
gonna have to really look at.
Well, that was going to be my question. Is so of all of you in this room, all of you are SPJ members, of those of you, even if it's been a fleeting moment, have thought, I think I might want to run for president. How high on the list was, do I want to commit 3 to 4 years? Because if you're going to run for president of SPJ right now, it's a 3-year commitment. And if we talk about time being a barrier, is that idea of a ladder a barrier in itself to finding the best people to run? Now, maybe they just run for the board and not the president. So I think what we're now doing is we're talking about the presidency, not the leadership of the association. So it's important, I think, that we keep those separate. But if you do want to get on the board because someday you want to become president, but we require 3 years, is that a barrier? Will people not run in the first
Probably a
place?
good question for past nominating chairs, whether they found that pushback.
But Patty may be clear on this, but is that your task force looking at keeping the current model but updating it, or looking at all of that and the new, what we talked about earlier?
The idea, I
So,
think,
you
of the task force is to ultimately decide, we think this is best for the society.
I think you blow it up.
I think everything's on the table, in my opinion.
Well,
That
yes,
including-
but I have a lot of specific questions when we get to that place about what is to be considered by the task force and what should be put aside
aside
and
for later.
considered later by other people.
Yes. So any other barriers that prevent people from serving?
I think still an impression that it's hard to get in, that it's a club, and I don't have the password to get in the door.
Exclusivity.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
don't mean that in a elitist way. I just mean there are a lot of people who have no idea how you end up being on a board, what would be the steps to get there and so forth.
What else? Any others? The bylaws are a barrier.
Well,
No offense,
absolutely.
Bob.
Depending on how they're written.
This is not necessarily a barrier to getting on the board, but once you're on the board, I think one of the most alarming things to me has been the constancy of the position. And by that, I mean the emails. It is so much to keep up with. And there are certain days I just have to go, can't participate in that one. I got a full slate. I have no time to even do more than just go and
Yeah.
on. So that's, I kind of like the idea. I know we're jumping all around here, but I kind of like the ONA model of once a month. Save it for the next meeting, please, unless it's, world beating important, gotta respond today.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's exhausting and such a time suck.
That's a cultural thing. And
yeah.
Lynn and I have
That's
already
the
talked a
relevant.
little bit about that.
Yeah.
Right. And most associations do whatever they can. The executive directors I've talked to, they do what they can to eliminate and certainly curtail the between the meetings conversations.
We've had far more Skyped or Zoomed meetings this year than I personally am happy with.
And 90% of them, I think, are related to individual projects, individual ideas that are not strategic in nature. It's not something the leadership has decided on. It's the rowing. I have this idea that we should be doing. Here, let's go with it, right? And so that's what a lot of that is. And so to try to curtail that and change the culture is something we're gonna work on that regardless of where the task force ends up. And I think a lot of improvement can be made through working on the culture and the expectations and better training, all of the sorts of things. When I talk to executive directors, one of the things I find is most of them have a board retreat. They talk about how to be an effective board, and they spend in a meeting, entire meeting, on a board retreat concept, how to be more effective leaders, and they
How are we
bring in
gonna work
outside
together?
consultants.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't do that because there's too much business on the agenda. When are we going to fit it in? And
Well, there's also 23 people.
that's the other
Too
part too.
expensive.
And it's expensive. And when do we have the time? And so you have all of these barriers to being the most effective leadership group that you can be. And it's all based in the traditions that we have. So, all right. So moving on from barriers, one of the other ideas on how to fill these roles was to advertise for specific skills and traits. So we talked about a little bit about that earlier, like what are the criteria of good leaders of associations. And I don't know if any of you want to throw out ideas or what you think is important for traits. I think one of the things I think we all agree on is having a diverse set of voices is incredibly important. But what else? Is there anything specifically that that we didn't throw out earlier when we were sharing adjectives that we think would be incredibly important traits that the task force should consider. And Patty, I'm on that task force, so I'll be able to help identify traits from other associations.
Good job.
Well, because you want diversity, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to pick people who are all alike.
Yeah.
Right.
And they all are forward thinking. Maybe you need people who are very limited in their thinking and can pick out and know where the commas go. You know,
Well, there's value on a board to have someone who does have historical knowledge, but who's
Yeah.
not a roadblock to progress.
We always done it this way. Why do we have to change it?
Yeah,
You don't
yeah.
want that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but some,
Almost
it's like
build on it.
anything else.
Yeah.
History tends to repeat itself, and you have a sense of, well, we've been there before.
Mhm.
This is either we didn't move, or this is what we should have done, and then you help to guide along the way. But you can't be an impediment to moving forward.
One of the biggest challenges to competency-based boards, the two of the biggest are historical knowledge. And associations who've had an executive director who've been there for a long time are better off, but as soon as that person is gone, there's nothing, right? So historical knowledge is sometimes difficult to achieve. And then the second one is enough diversity in voice, because you still will end up with a slate of candidates, no matter how hard you try, that some years may be too similar, and there are obvious gaps. So one of the ways associations deal with both of those is that they set aside appointment slots. So maybe the model is you decide, I think O&A actually just did this. They created 2 slots for those very reasons, that they felt like we needed different types of voices on their board, but they weren't necessarily coming through the election. So they created now, I think they added 2 spots instead of removing 2 and replacing them with appointments. But something to consider, I think, is that's a way to always really ensure that you're getting what you want. So that's an idea.
So that requires flexibility then in the drafting of bylaws that would allow you to add and or remove as the board deems appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that you're, I don't know, let's just say 7-member board with 2 potential appointees, and in one year you don't need any, so you're board 7. But maybe the next year you do, and maybe your board's 9. Or maybe you just say that it's a 7 elected and 2 automatic appointees, and then the board appoints because they're required to. So you could do it that way too. But that's one way around that.
Up to a certain number, right?
Yeah.
Up on the full board?
Yeah, the total board.
No, there's no maximum number. We could have a board of 200.
Is there a minimum?
The requirement, you may be thinking of is that it's required by law that the foundation have 1 more independently elected board member than SPJ representatives.
Joe,
Yeah.
so I think, having the appointed solve is even more important, because if you do have like groups of people running as a slate, slates tend by their very nature to be people who think alike,
Right.
possibly who even look alike, not necessarily, but in some cases. So, you have this slate, and then you sort of have 5 very like-minded individuals running the show, then having those appointed slots to bring that diversity of voices in,
Yeah.
I think would even become more crucial.
Who does the appointing?
The board would. It'd be like
So you have the 5 that look alike and sound alike appointing. Who do you think they're going to appoint?
there is a
But that's not necessarily so. I think
Yeah.
the 5 people that look alike and think alike will realize we all think alike, and we need to have this diversity.
there's a little unspoken thread among when I talk to people about this. And one of the fears of existing governances is that what will happen if this changes? Who will take over? Right? It's this like nobody will say, I'm afraid that group will take over, or that body of people, or those types of people will take over. But it's an undercurrent theme, right? And so you go down this road of, well, how can we give total competency based, anybody can run, but with restrictions that we still control that this thing's not going off the rails? And the answer is you can't. Like ultimately, you have to have trust in membership electing the right person, period. That's it. And whoever the membership elects, that's who the membership elects. That's why, though, there are things on the back end, alternating terms. So you can run as a slate 1 year, but the next year, half of those people are rolling off, right? Or term limits. So they're there for a while. That's great. They won. They did their thing. But even if it's an awful slate, and the fear usually outweighs the reality, right? It usually doesn't happen. But if for some instance something bad happens with a term limit, it's limited. Your exposure is limited. So those are the ways that organizations have put things in place to protect themselves from things, groups that may go awry.
I have a question. This is an aside, but it dovetails on a point you made earlier when you first mentioned term limits. From your research or your awareness, what is the general number of years that groups have set term limits at?
I think most people I've talked to, it's 2 consecutive terms, so that would be 4 years. Yeah, and then that doesn't preclude many of them from running again, but they have to take a year
Take
off.
a term off.
Yeah.
Joe, is there a way because in our case, our, the executive director has both historical knowledge and has forward thinking. Is there a role, or should there be a role, for the executive director to guide that process of who is on the board?
Yeah, and I think a staff member, executive director, I think is part of or an advisory voice on the nominating committee. Because
Do
I
you
think
do that now?
no, because it doesn't matter. I mean, I do share names with Dana if I have ideas of people who I think would make good candidates. So I don't not share names, but I'm not actively looking for types of people because it doesn't matter. Because if I don't know, and this is how you say it, I don't know of somebody in a certain region who may have these skills or traits, but if I do, I recommend them, but I don't know them that well. So, but I think being involved in the nominations process from the conversations we're having today, these are the types of people you're looking for. Are your voices well represented enough? Are you diverse enough? I think a staff member could help in that regard. And I think just from a practical standpoint, any task force, any committee should have a staff member on it, because the staff member is the one who can put it on their Outlook calendar and say, you guys said you're meeting, like we need to meet. So if nothing else, just the logistics and to keep the ball moving, it's important to have a staffer on it, I think. And that's in this book. This book goes as far as to say all committees should be chaired by staff members.
That ain't gonna fly.
So, we're not.
That's a good one.
Two things. We're not talking about the possibilities of what we can get done, Robert. Secondly, I don't think you'll hear a single staffer say they have a desire in chairing a committee.
Hey Tara, which ones you want?
But it's the concept of staff should be involved. The experts, if your programming committee, whoever is in charge of programming on a staff level should be involved and engaged, and that's the concept.
I'm wanting to jump back to what coming with a little while. I was texting with my wife and I kind of lost track here. But sorry about that. Somebody was talking about the historical perspective in this sense. And I mean, Guinan kind of forced this situation where the FDX president shows up at executive committee meetings. But I don't think the FDX president should ever be a voting member of the SPJ board, but I think having that person as ex officio does serve a purpose.
Yep, that's a good way to do it too. There's a lot of ex officio models out there. And Robert mentioned earlier about having voices from our other associations, represented at the table. Now, what I will tell you is, I think that's an ideal model that a lot of people strive for. When you get into the practical matter of it, those folks don't want to serve because they're already often serving on their own board, and they're having the same challenges finding people to serve that we are. And so when you approach these groups and say, hey, would 3 or 4 of your people be interested in serving on our board? They're like, if they're interested in serving on a board, we're going to take them. So it's easier said than done, I think. But that doesn't mean you can't have, call on them for advice for short things or, whatever. But ex officio positions are popular as well.
I think we may have a legal issue with that because of Illinois law. And remember, we tried to put a member of the foundation board in to do things like review Joe's position.
Yeah.
And so I'm questioning whether we can have an outsider. And I don't know the answer. All I know is we got to ask the question.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, the foundation certainly has representation on this board because Sue's on the foundation board, I'm on the foundation board. Everybody here is on the foundation board.
Well, I mean, it's traditional. I
We
mean,
get stipends and you don't.
the president will appoint the officers to serve on as our representatives on the SDX board, just because that's the best cross-pollination possible. And it's also, again, going back to the education of the officers, having the secretary treasurer and the president-elect on the SDX board brings them along. We do, I mean, we do have some fairly decent training for officers that's in place.
But
So-
that's at the whim of the current president.
Well, I think, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, that's
Ultimately,
historically
yes.
what's happened.
Yeah,
but,
ultimately, yeah, ultimately that you are correct. That's right. And you could appoint whoever the hell you want next year. But
All right. Any other skills, traits, specifics? Any ideas, thoughts? All right. We just talked about slots for appointments or ex officio positions, so I think we can move on from that. One of the barriers, I think, to finding these types of people is it's the size of the board, and we're going to jump down and talk about that a little bit later, so I'm going to skip that for now. But the general idea being it's easier to find, I'll say 7. It's easier to find 7 than it is 23. So barrier to finding the types of leaders you want is how many you're looking for. But we'll talk about that in a minute. The other idea I had, I think, is we'll see how this goes. Not all these ideas do I think are best, but it's what other associations do. So it's something to be considered. Revamping the nominations process by how we find the candidates. One of them is candidates must be vetted before they're allowed on the ballot. So in this instance, you would have a situation where a group of people, whoever that is, says yes or no. You can run, you can't. That's a lot of associations do that.
How?
They determine the criteria. They write the job description. They determine who the types of people they're looking for, and it's just like a job interview. When the applications come in, you see if it meets the criteria, and if it does, they go on the slate, and if they don't, they don't.
They can still be nominated from the floor, at least under the current bylaws.
If you want to allow for that, sure,
So the nominating committee would potentially be
Could be.
the vetting body as well.
could be.
De facto, aren't they? Or is it he, is it or she, as the case may be?
In some respects, I think that's true. I mean, if
you don't want
ask,
someone on the board, you don't call them.
But if they call you.
But yeah, but
and
if
say,
they
"I wanna
call
run,"
you,
we
if
don't
we
say,
have
no,
If we have an
sorry.
open
We don't tell anybody
application
no.
system, right?
Yeah, so the difference is the other way around.
I do think this would eliminate running from the floor, because the goal is, well, true, declare your candidacy 5 days before. So whenever people declare their candidacy, they would go through a vetting process, and a group to be determined by the leadership, I suppose, would determine if that person is qualified and eligible to be on the board. I will say that ensures you are getting the right types of people you want. Of course, you have a group of people determining who those groups are, and that I think is a challenge. Certainly, our members will have. We don't trust small bodies of people picking things. doing
That's how
things.
corporate boards work.
It is.
They have a nominating committee and they decide who of their buddies they want.
Okay, then my question is who picks the nominating committee?
Right. I think under the current most models, it's the board.
Well, the nominating committee here is the immediate past president. I don't know, that's not formal, is it, Bob? That's not in the bylaws, that's just,
no,
That's good.
Coyer didn't do it.
that's right.
I can
No,
see,
no committee is in the bylaws.
So,
What,
so
any
who
committee?
handles that right now? Is that the president's discretion, who's on the nominating committee? Or it's just been a task that's been
The nominating
traditionally
committee-
given to the immediate past president?
Typically, it's been just one person. I mean, I think Dana
It's not
had,
really a committee.
It's a lot of work.
she had somebody helping her, Becky Talent
Mhm.
was helping her on
Mhm.
some of the college advisor seats.
no, someone else, Sunny had people help too. 'Cause
Yeah.
he asked me, I helped him. I remember that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Patty, as I understand, I think it's important to understand why that is, as I understand it. The idea being the president has just traveled all across the country and had the opportunity to meet lots of people. So she or he could then maybe reach down into some of these rank and file with the people that they've met. I don't think that actually happens. And I also think that sets you up for a situation where you're trying to find one person. Like, who's the person who can fill this? Like, that's another reason. I don't know if we'd have contested races certainly for the RD spots, but I do think that's another reason that exists, is because the nominations committee is one person doing work in addition to their regular job after having just gone through the meat grinder of the SPJ presidency, and now we're asking them to do more. And I think having one person traditionally is problematic. But, And there has been efforts to try to make it a committee, but it's never really taken off yet.
Back to your point about sort of, I guess, vetting people before it makes its way. I guess I see pros and cons because you could have someone who is not related to journalism at all. I mean, really, potentially, you could have just some, I don't know, blogger who, I'm just kind of thinking like, or who just tweets all the time and like harasses newspapers and is mad at the media, and they might want to run for the board, and
They
get
wouldn't
a-
qualify for membership. A
Let's-
blogger would,
well,
but
Let's say
but
they
we don't
were when
check
they
our
were
a
membership.
professional harasser.
let's
But
say
we
they
don't check our
were
membership.
let's say they were when they were a student, and then they became a pro, right?
They
And
kept it.
then they stepped
we
out of
don't
business
check.
for 20 years. If they've kept their membership current, they keep pro membership status.
Even if they're insurance salesmen.
Yes.
That's true.
Yes.
So I mean, I could see like, then okay, they run, and that we could see that kind of potentially being a problem of someone like that that's like harassing the media, or who knows, not sort of pushing forward what SPJ wants being on the board, and so that's where maybe a vetting process could stop that from happening. I don't know how often that would happen, but it could. Then I'm trying to think of other areas, so kind of that situation aside, but just like a practicing journalist or an attorney who works in media law, or a FOIA advocate, someone like that. Trying to think of other things that would maybe keep them from being vetted. Go ahead.
Somebody who really wants to serve on the board but has no past history, track record whatsoever of being a visionary or an entrepreneurial type person.
But wouldn't you just let the members decide that and let them pick?
That's what this whole question's about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just
know.
kind of
Yeah,
thinking
yeah,
that out
I know.
because
What's the screening? I think
Yeah.
there's two key questions. How do they come in the door, right? Do we pick them, or do we just, all comers? And then secondly, what's the vetting process by which they end up on the ballot?
Right.
And then, of course, the election is a whole nother discussion, but
Could, I
one
mean,
thing at a time.
I'm sorry, could something be considered of having the membership vote for the nominating committee?
I think that's probably too far into the weeds, and it opens it up to all kinds of potential abuses and issues and challenges.
Okay.
No, it's nice to make that whole democratic process, but I think you really, number one, I think having one person do it is both unfair
I
and impractical. Number two,
Especially if we're going to widen the
Yeah.
pool in this
but I
dramatic
really
way.
think, again, keeping a nominating committee to like 3 people, something in an odd, you got to keep the odd number, is manageable. It's realistic. At least that's been my experience. And again, it's a hugely important role. You help to guide the direction by just helping to, vet all the candidates.
I've heard over and over and over the most important committee of any successful association is the nominations
Yeah.
committee.
And we don't have one.
Right.
Right. So
Um,
should this be part of what the task force recommends,
Sure.
what a
It's
nominating
a
committee
procedural thing,
would
yeah.
look like, who would select the members,
Yeah.
and then what they're going to do going forward to actually,
Like, what would the role be?
what's
Whether
their
they
role,
vet or
how do they
yeah, the vetting
Yeah.
too, I think.
recruit
adding to
and
that.
vet? I mean, those are kind of like almost two discrete tasks,
Well,
right? The
recruit or
recruiting
vet.
part
And or vet, and do we
Yeah.
want them
and
to vet?
or vetting.
You could have to be the just recruits. I mean, the whole idea of vetting, I don't know, it's not good.
I don't know how comfortable I feel with it, because I don't want someone that has a great resume and is just doesn't have a track record of doing things. Like, I don't really want that person on the board personally, but I also think that's up to the members to decide, and don't know that I would feel comfortable with a small group of 3 or 4 people saying no to them. I mean, hopefully people talk, and hopefully we can the members can rally behind certain people and get the people that they
So
want.
everybody knows here I'm playing devil's advocate and I'm
Yeah.
just throwing out ideas.
Yeah.
Britain just let members decide.
I know.
So did the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's the
And now
devil.
they have regret. They want
And they
to
have
redo their vote.
That's right.
What's the EU?
And so what we have to arrive at as a group, as the association, as the leadership, what you have to arrive at is that level of comfort between how do we get the most qualified board, but how do we not become what we usually stand against. And I think there may be some creative ways that people on the task force and talking to others, and I'll do more research to figure out how to maybe minimize one and enhance the other. One example of that, and then Sue, is like ONA is an example of this, but there's other associations. You have to be, if you want to run for office, you have to be nominated by someone. So maybe some people say you have to be nominated by a sitting board member. or some groups might say you have to be nominated by another member, that's about as low, I think, of a barrier that would probably exist. But so is there a process, or is there a way or an idea that people have to have some sort of standing credibility amongst their peers before they can arrive on the
Like a
ballot?
sponsor almost or something.
Something
Well,
like
and
that.
you could say you have to be recommended or nominated by 6 members or 10 members.
Yeah. Now that's a barrier because now who wants to go out and find them? And so so really you're weighing you're weighing all of these factors is what we have to do. So,
And I think the vetting thing, you don't need to go that deep into the weeds, frankly. You just want to make certain they're a paid member. And there are a number of folks who try to take leadership positions who aren't even members, or they've let it slide. I mean, again, it's just I think it's a perfunctory type of thing, basic thing. You don't have to dig into it. I think you're right. I think the members will, by the information provided by the candidates, it should become pretty evident where they are in the matter. But I think you have to have some initial vetting.
And we don't want to set up a new barrier, but I think the language that we would create around this has to be clear, the kinds of people we're looking for.
Yeah.
So if you get some gadfly who's just been home, writing letters to the editor for 20 years, probably isn't going to check all the boxes. And that's an easy poll. But what I think, that you would be generous in your,
Right.
and you would forward candidates that are legitimate in most, check most of the boxes, but I don't think a real nut house is going to sneak through.
Well, but if we didn't vet though, they potentially could.
Right.
Yeah.
So I do think there should be some
Right.
vetting.
At a very simple level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right. So it's the one of the things I think the task force has to figure out, and the board ultimately will have to decide is what is our level of comfort with how this slate comes together is, and historically it has been whoever wants to throw their hat in the ring, they could serve in a role of national leadership. And what I have found is most really good associations that have those visionary leaders, they don't do that. They make it, they really try to streamline their processes to have the best people rise to the top. Now, what I will also say is a lot of these associations are made up of bankers, and they're made up of accountants, and they're not made up of people who fight for free speech, First Amendment, and democracy.
Yeah.
And that's where we're unique.
We're different.
I mean,
Yeah.
IRE,
So-
ONA, any of the other journalism organizations go to that?
ONA, I know, has to have a member nominate you.
Yeah, that's not a mental affair.
No, and IRE, I'm not
Hey,
sure.
Patty, will you nominate me?
You're in.
Right.
Anyone can run from
I think
IRE?
so.
Yeah. And I will tell you, like we're talking about them as having a model that works for them. I think what I would say, and I haven't talked to them specifically, so I don't know if they feel this way, but I know ONA works with it, like Jane works with an executive committee. So even in this model that we think may be better than what we have, or some elements of it anyway are appealing. She still has frustrations with the makeup of her board sometimes, and as does any executive director. And that's why you often have executive committees that work more closely with staff. And then it comes back to the bigger question: if you're going to have an executive committee, now you have another layer of governance. What's the point? And it all kind of goes. So even with the associations we're pulling these little bits and pieces of nuggets that we think may be good. It doesn't eliminate all of the issues, and it never will. It never will, but it can be vastly better, vastly improved, and by board development and board retreats and training people and nominations processes, you give yourself a much better chance for success. And that's ultimately. So what about anything else on the
Can I
concept
say-
of how to find the right
Let me
types of
just say
people?
one other thing.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I'm not sure what exactly you're going to ask me the task force to do, but at the delivery end, when these candidates, and I'll stick with the 50, right? These 50 great people who have been vetted in whatever way we decide, we get to convention, how will they share their message? They can share it online. There can be a lot of advanced publicity and so forth, but that really affects so many other things down the road if we're going to let them speak, for example, to the entire membership, and if everybody's going to one member, one vote. So just, again, I'm not sure how much the task force is going to, I'm going to need a lot of direction in that regard.
I think that's beyond your
Yeah.
purview personally.
Okay.
But
I was going to say the whole governance thing. I mean, I see the day where aren't going to take it to the floor. I see it as an organization that's a one person, one vote. You vote online, you vote whatever. I think the membership meeting, the general, I know RTDNA does, throws it out there. It's done. It's just over with. That becomes a non-issue. That's, I think, what we have to strive for.
Yeah, see, that's a little scary to me, to
It-
vote for somebody on paper I never met, who's going to be one of 9 people on a board. Because as you said, they might look great on paper, but as soon as you meet someone, can I work with this person? Do we have kind of a similar, maybe rowing together?
That's where you ask.
So-
I mean, because I know with IRE, I don't know all of the people. I know a lot of people, but not all of them. So I Google them. I look at for me, something that's important is, are they active on social media? Are they actively engaging in things that matter to me that I want someone to represent me in journalism for? I'll even email people that they might know or that I might know that know them and kind of ask questions if I'm unsure.
I'm sure you do a lot more work than
Yes,
many people.
probably.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think of the investment mailings that I get on behalf of the foundation, and it says, "Hey, we're having elected board of directors," and it's a piece of paper, right? It's like, and I get 50 of them. I don't know who these people are,
Right.
So I do think that's a process question that I think
Okay.
that will be hammered out way down the road. I will say, you were going to say something real quick, but O&A, they actually have a session at their conference where people get up and they get a 2-minute speech, 1-minute speech. It's a rapid fire, and that's it, more or less. Yeah.
Lot of people, one brain. So we'll look at other models for you to play around with, but the O&A model where there's a membership meeting, the candidates speak for a few minutes, but the voting actually takes place after the conference is over.
Yeah.
And so I think that, I'm not sure all the objectives in that, but I think one of them is to make sure that all the membership has an opportunity to learn about the candidates, because not everybody is able to attend their annual event.
Yeah.
So there's an announcement, like, I don't know, 2 weeks after the conference that we get that says, here are our new board members, and we'll let you know in a few more weeks who will be the president.
I'll throw another really weird traditional wrinkle in. I've come across a lot of associations that met executive directors that they purposely their board doesn't meet during their annual conference. Purposely. So.
Why?
Because they're members of the association who want to take advantage of this amazing conference. And if you have a bunch of meetings, you can't, primarily.
This is true.
Or because leaders don't want anything to run concurrent to those governance things, and so now you've cut into the attendees who are there for training.
But the boards are smaller. They meet 2 times a year at different times, and they can manage it. They can afford it. The meetings that they have are productive, and they're not trying to churn through business.
Well,
That's
if
really
you
interesting.
put the governance meetings on the shoulders of the convention, then you're not interrupting the co-development part.
I've tried not to equate specifics to I read this stuff, how does this work in SPJ, but it's impossible not to do. And I have wondered if the board gets smaller, and if we do these retreats and we do these things, all these ideal scenarios, and that's what they all are. They're ideal scenarios. Does our board essentially adopt the executive committee schedule? Does it meet once in January, once in June? The conference is the conference. There's no meeting there other than the membership meeting, and that's it. And so the board actually meets twice a year in person. I do think, however, there has to be some sort of mechanism where new board members are engaged fairly quickly, as opposed to being, if our election cycle continues with convention, then they don't do anything for 6 months. I think that's problematic. But I have kind of started to play through the schedule of what does the future of board meetings even look like, when and where and how. But anyway, we don't want to drill out too far on
Warm
that.
in the winter.
Huh?
Warm
in the winter. Right. Yes, remove the barriers.
San Diego, January, be there,
So any other,
Don't change jobs.
Forget Ohio. We don't go back to Ohio.
Virgin Islands would be fine.
any other thoughts or ideas on how we to remove barriers, or how do we fill the board with the types of people the association thinks we would want? Any other thoughts? All right, so this is going to be most likely an exercise in futility, but I want to start and to help give Patty some groundwork.
That's a hell of a way to
Yep.
lead.
I know, because I think this is the inevitable question that we can continue to kick this can down the road. But I want to start laying some groundwork on how we should arrive at this, and that's the size. What's the optimal size for this association? And so I think we should kind of start brainstorming and figure out what the ultimate size is. But I don't want to ask you what the ultimate size is. I want to start the conversation and ask, what viewpoints do we need represented on our board? And can you make a list for
I'd
me
love to make a list.
on the thingy? Terry, you do minutes. I want to take you away from that awesome
I think
task.
she really wanted them marked.
I know she did. She'll do anything
It's
to
just,
get
I
the
would
minutes.
smell it. I'm sitting close to
All right. So what
Just use one of
viewpoints?
the others.
What viewpoints? And I'll let you use the word representation. But what viewpoints need to be on the board?
I think we definitely need people from major news organizations. I think that's something that we really lack, and it might just be even one or two, but it's something even I know with the stuff Catherine has been working so hard on with the PIO issue. Yes, we have them in our membership, but not engaged probably as much as we should, and it's hurting. I think it hurts our pushes and our fights for this, for FOI stuff, and specifically the PIO stuff. So I think that would help because they're engaged, and then when you're engaged, you sort of feel obligated, right? That my organization might step up now, and then if the AP does it, Washington Post follows, or whatever that might be.
Exactly. And also too, I mean, right now I think one of the highest profile members we have is Andrew Seaman with Reuters. I mean, Reuters, that's a national news organization. So having a couple that said key people from national news organizations can only help.
What else?
From different platforms.
Yep.
All,
Multi-platform.
all kinds of medias are represented.
I think it would be neat to also, and I don't know if this is like a requirement, but I would like to see non-journalists and not even just educators, but FOIA attorneys. I mean, that kind of thing.
Journalism advocates.
Yeah, journalism advocates. Some more people from like that are advocates and not just
I like that.
working, because that could be. I think it would be an interesting kind of mix. It
Who
could.
are or are not members?
Well, I think right now, according to the bylaws, you have to be a member.
But we're not
correct.
we're not going to
Okay.
live in the what
Okay.
now.
I'm throwing it out.
Wait
I
till we
would
have
say a member.
supporters.
I mean, they can pay $75.
That's my feeling.
Really, wait till we have supporters. I mean,
I'd
Bylaws
say
say
maybe
they
someone,
can't,
I'd say
the
maybe
proposed
someone
bylaw says they can't vote.
who's not tied to, but understands the history of
Bylaw
the
change.
SPJ, understands the
But change it
organization.
before you're
Someone
right.
who does or does not.
Who
Why
does
aren't- why
understand
aren't
the
we
organization.
recruiting
So
those people
someone
to
with
be members?
historical knowledge?
Historical
Right.
I'm a
knowledge.
member.
I think you can do.
You remember when you were a journalist, though, right?
Yeah,
was.
but still, I mean, there are others like it.
And we didn't
Yeah.
kick you out.
You did not.
Right, yeah.
I kept paying my dues.
I was in PR for 20 years, so.
What else?
Young journalists and veteran journalists, there's some kind of representation. More so, I'm again like Pat. I'm thinking I go back to the students who have a different kind of voice in all of this.
So just youth or.
Yeah, when I say youth, I'm not thinking students, I'm thinking 20-somethings who are reinventing everything right now.
Also, I liked the idea of somebody who knows the business model and the various options out there, the nonprofit model for journalism.
Like a news administrator.
I don't know if that necessarily is the case so much as it's almost in that vision.
It's a
someone,
visionary.
yeah.
Like right now, I would say those are the people that, I mean, there are app only investigative, like phone app investigative journalism things that are popping up, which I think is very interesting and very cool. And those are the kind of things like, what's that next step? Those kind of people that are.
Yeah, somebody who's keeping an eye on where we're going.
Yeah.
I don't know how you write that on the flip chart, but
I think one of the things that SPJ needs to get out of is looking at journalism as print broadcast.
That's what we talked about, multi-platform.
And really, not multi-platform, multi ways of practicing journalism. And it's not platform, that's whether it's freelancers or there are bloggers who are basically journalists. It's not just the platform, it's
No, I didn't
how
really
they
mean that in
do-
terms of
how they
delivery.
do
I mean just
journalism.
that
Who are
we
doing the job.
represent
Yes,
all
yes.
spectrums of
I mean, an entrepreneurial journalist
production
who
of journalism.
carve their own niche.
Right, but also the BNAs and McGraw Hills of the
I know
world
what you mean,
are
we're trying to find the right
a
word.
completely
So we
different
got all the
environment for
Yeah.
journalism.
Forget.
Trade journalism is one part of that, would you say?
Hmm?
Trade
Yeah,
journalism,
yeah,
one
but-
example.
Yeah, but not having a person for each one of those, but
No.
having people who
Sectors
represent
that are
these
known.
kinds of things.
we're overrepresented.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah,
overrepresented.
exactly.
Overrepresented for trade journalism right now.
Right,
And that doesn't have to be their current job.
No, but people with
No, people with
Knowledge of
experience
that
in trade
piece of
journalism
the
or
industry.
radio or
Yeah.
blogging.
Online or whatever.
Yeah.
I think, racial gender diversity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris, can you make those two different things?
I will.
Thank you.
You mean like a gay Latino woman wouldn't do it for you?
Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute.
I know we've talked around this, but the idea of having representation or viewpoints from our regions, assuming we have a regional structure going forward, from our communities, SPJ communities / committees world, as well as thirdly, our affiliate our partners. So I think those are things to think about and talk about, whether they should have a voice or a,
Can you make those all separate?
yeah, so sorry.
Do you know how much paper costs?
I do, $30.
Efficient.
That was $30.
Mhm.
For a flip
Or a
chart.
big sheet of paper.
Write
that's-
smaller,
I had to
Chris.
go with the flip chart.
As someone who
distance.
needs readers, I would,
No, I appreciate it. I'm gonna put on my readers to see you write.
What else? You say regional, does chapter the same?
See, but I would not, again, that you're presuming that this model is going to stay. We might be looking far enough down the
Yeah,
road that
yeah.
chapters will not exist. So I just think on a
Or
regional
regions
basis,
might not.
And they may
we
not
don't-
exist
we don't
either.
yet know that.
but at least you got to make certain that they're not all East Coasters
Right.
or West Coasters. I mean, you need the diversity that the whole country encompasses.
But do
Also
you-
too, I mean, but also, the else there, like the urban journalism versus rural journalism.
That's
Yeah.
much more the case, yes.
Because it goes back to what Joe was saying. What if the best 7 or 9 people are on the East Coast? Just bring a West Coast person in just so you have, I mean.
Oh, I'm not
Joe's
saying anything is
different.
precluded.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is when you're looking at the who's,
Yeah.
these are the factors that you take into consideration. You may still say, I don't care, we'll live with the fact that they're all from the East Coast. And we'll take the heat because we think that's the best board. But they have to be discussed and vetted fully.
I listened to this whole regions argument, and I've seen it through when we tried to cut down the number. People were saying, well, people in Montana don't think the way people in California think. I can't imagine that a journalist at the Denver Post doesn't think kind of the way a journalist at the New York Times thinks. You know, they're all trying to do the same thing, and a blogger in San Diego is probably going to think about the technology the same way as a blogger in Philadelphia.
I think where that
I don't
comes
know if
from.
there are regional differences.
I think where that comes from, and I think it's important to understand that I think there's legitimacy to it, and if they say that it's important to them, then it is, and that's the end of it. Whether or not we think it's important to them is irrelevant. They think it is, and I do think there are issues that journalists face statewide, and whether that's legislation. Journalists in one state have different hurdles than journalists in other states, and regionally. You know, maybe environmental journalism is more important and bigger out west than it is on the East Coast, and so I do think there are differences among regions in terms of how they have to do their jobs and what they cover. What I don't necessarily agree, however, is that the voices with those specifics should be driving the National Association's agenda, vision, and goals. So I think it's important and it makes total sense to continue to have some sort of exchange and relationship among journalists of certain localities. But I don't think you need those voices to manage a national association, because those are not national issues.
And I think it doesn't, when people were saying those different things, I honestly thought it was really ridiculous because, I can see where they're coming from. And yes, I hear it all the time. Like when nightly news airs on the East Coast, they like never have West Coast stories like ever, but it still airs all around the country. And people complain about that in our newsroom. So I get it, but I don't think that means that you can't work with one another or like combine things because you're in different cities and we can't all work together. Like I think that is so crazy. And I don't want those, I hope that type of conversation doesn't lead to who we're picking or how we're kind of selecting and making up the board in the future.
So what other viewpoints?
Already got a 15-person board.
Try to get a couple of twofers.
Or 3.
And so this is my point. This is the whole point of this exercise. When you start thinking about what are all the different viewpoints we feel are necessary on our board, well, we've got to 15 and we've only spent 5 minutes talking about it. Right?
There's no reason why you couldn't get twofers, threefers, fourfers.
That's right. So the point being, the desire to have a significant number of viewpoints on your board should not always directly correlate with the number of bodies on your board. So it comes back to the question of what's the number that allows you to be efficient but give you enough voices. So are any of those up there? Can any of them be combined?
Well, you can certainly have somebody from a major news organization who's a journalism advocate who has historical knowledge and might be young.
Sure.
And could be black and female.
So
You've just combined 7.
right. So we have a board now.
Find them.
We have a board of 3. All right, so now we have a board of 3. So does everybody feel good with the board of 3? What's up, Patty? No?
A board of one.
Board of 1?
You.
Done. Done.
Let's go.
Meeting over.
Now,
Boy,
just-
this
but
was
here's the thing.
productive.
Passes
You still
unanimously.
need, they may come from all these, and represent all these various interests and concerns and so forth, but you still need the variety of ideas and input, because our individual perspectives, we come with our own baggage or lack thereof, and the more voices within certain limitations, I think only adds to the conversation and allows you to elaborate or knock down. Again, I think 7 to 9 is not an unrealistic number. I think you can work within that. Generally speaking, unless you're like the Supreme Court and can't find that ninth person, you can have
been
a
found.
decision. You can have a decision if there's a split vote. I don't think you want to go over 9. I think that becomes a little unwieldy. But 3 is obviously just for the hell of it, fun and impractical. But I think, again, thinking of the history of the organization, we are participatory, and we cover people who complain that their voices are not heard. So I think you still have to maintain that in some manner, shape, or form. Again, some of that goes to how we structure the big picture, the voices coming from the bottom up in some manner, shape, or form. But I would hesitate to go over. That I think becomes, again, too problematic. But that's for your task force to.
The general feeling is the more it's obvious, the problems with the larger board are obvious. We've talked about those. It's harder to keep culture. It's harder to train. It's harder to keep people engaged. Fewer people end up making decisions anyway. The problem with smaller boards is not necessarily that you can't get the work done, but there's no room. There's no room for different viewpoints. There's no room for, so if you do limit it to 3, and you end up having 3 people win the election, right? And they're all very similar. And you can appoint, let's just say the group decides it's going to appoint 2. So now your board's 5, which is what the book says. Did we leave room for enough different viewpoints on the national leadership? And I think the general consensus with 3-person board would be no. Even though the business may be able to get done. And 3 people certainly could be visionary. And it's easier to find 3 than it is to find 7. So you could find 3 dynamic people to lead this association forward. No problem. But does that leave room for enough viewpoints of membership? So,
And then, of course, if we're going to allow an open election, we could have, again, that 50 and end up with a mix that really is not what we set out to attain. So I really like the idea of having a number plus 2 or plus 3, so that if we are lacking one of these key constituents or key viewpoints, the board would have the latitude to fill that, to round out the.
so let's say it's 2, right? For argument's sake right now, 2 appointed positions. So that's now 2 of your board. So at what point, so if you guys can think back to, I don't know, a board meeting or whatever, start playing in your head. We're going to start with 1. There's a board member. 1 is not realistic. 3 is not realistic. So let's go to 5. So you already have 2, so that means total of 7. So 5 elected, 2 appointed. Is 7 a manageable number to do strategic planning that gives you a well-rounded, enough room for the viewpoints, 7 total people?
Why would you not have a strategic planning committee so that
And you would,
the board would then not have to do?
but the board would, I think the board would have to be on it. And that's the point of the board, is to be your strategic planning committee. That's essentially what they are. But you do bring in outside voices to augment what the board may not have. So 7?
This group is 7 right now.
I like the 7 plus 2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
9?
Yeah.
Nine.
So, well,
That's mine.
the 7 and then you have the 2.
Up to 2.
So 9 total?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you need room for a resident bomb thrower.
Absolutely.
We've had some, and
You don't think you can get
They've
that
been
within the
useful.
7?
you could.
Yeah, I mean, if the bomb thrower gets the votes.
I want to see the board that appoints the bomb thrower. Like that'd be good.
I think a critical question here has to be the latter question, because I really can't wrap my brain around what the optimal number is until I know whether people are going to run as president, run as secretary treasurer, run as, what's the third one? Sorry,
President.
president. Well, you know, yeah. So
The latter now only has 2 elected positions, secretary treasurer and president-elect. almost had only one position in 2004 when it was proposed to remove secretary treasurer from the ladder. So the ladder used to be 4 or
Should we talk
5.
about that, whether we want that to be part of the process?
What does the group want?
Because that, for me, that helps me decide what's the best number.
I would say that's putting the cart before the horse.
You think?
I would say determining the size of your board and the types of people on your board based on what your leadership ladder might be, it's backward. I think your leadership ladder should reflect what you want your governance to be.
But I see, I think where
Mhm.
you're coming from, because then it takes up 3 of those. So let's say if it was the 7, so 9, that then takes up 3 seats for,
Of people who are coming in a
and they're there
defined
for
title
4 years.
leadership
And it's
role.
according to whether you continue to have the immediate past president. as the board
Right,
Well,
right.
But then again, get back to the whole beginning, which is, do we even want to continue with that process?
Right.
I think that's the question that has to be dealt with even before you move down this road. And if the role
Right,
model,
and I feel very conflicted on that because so we end up with these 9 people, right, or 7 people, and they were all just part of the 50. And did they come in with any specific, intent? Like, I'm going to be one of the 9. And then I'm going to be the president, and here are my goals. Here are my, right? Or did they just they're part of the scrum? I don't know.
I think you have
It's
both.
kind of scary. I really feel like we're on the ledge here, like
Well,
trying to, yeah.
And you'd have to have staggered terms. I mean,
Sure.
I
That's-
guess you wouldn't have to. Everything's on the table, but ideally you would, because you're not having a whole brand new group of 9
I would not
come in
encourage.
every year.
I would
Yeah.
encourage
Right,
staggered.
So
Yeah.
you have a little bit of,
Corporate boards are
And-
moving towards everybody elected every year.
that's,
Yeah.
Really?
A lot of,
Also,
yeah, a lot of shareholders.
Do you, did you see that if, you had like an independently elected independently elected president-elect, secretary treasurer, and then 5 board members, and then maybe plus 2 appointed? Do you see that being a recipe for conflict, or?
I think it could potentially be conflict if the person elected president is not respected or does not get the support from the others. Now, that certainly could be the case now. I mean, through history, and it has. But I would also say it didn't go so well in those years. It's important that everybody's rowing in the same direction to have maximum impact. And when your board is in conflict, everything stops.
and you said this is, oh no,
IRE does, yeah,
I-
IRE.
elects, and then they pick from
Then
within.
the board picks, yeah.
The model's there.
The thing I think that to think about the leadership ladder versus the non-leadership ladder is it's this. So do you want, if it's a 3-year process, that's what we're saying, but if your terms are only 2, right? How do you rectify that? Do you? And is the leadership ladder best for the association moving forward in a strategic way?
Here's an idea. Make your ladder 2 years. If you get 2-year terms, elect a president-elect with the understanding that he or she will serve as president the following year. So that your training is it's a 2-year cycle. And that follows if you set 2-year terms and you have 2 years, every 2 years people are rotating on and off of your board. That way you have some continuity and you have some certainty as to who's going to be running your board, so that every year you're electing the president-elect.
So if we take all the work away from all of the people that are doing on the board, if we rethink the way that the spokesperson thing functions, if we're kind of throwing everything out and then building it back up, what are we training that president-elect to do with the ladder?
Well, I will say, I think, let's say if Secretary Treasurer was out, I do think there is something to be said with sort of following and working closely with Paul, like this year in my role, seeing a lot of sort of what he's doing, especially when it comes to sort of working with some of the outside organizations and like the statements. And I understand, yes, that could change, but I have found that useful. And the same thing, like, yes, it was useful with Dana, but I could say you could probably eliminate one of those years. It was useful to see, okay, how they're responding, how the process works if you want to make a statement or say something, what contacts do we have? I mean, that there is a learning curve, and if you only have a year to kind of, if you want to make an impact and you want to push some of like your ideas forward or push SPJ forward, I feel like you would maybe lose some of that momentum if you didn't have some of that. So I can see the positive in at least maybe the year.
And I found working under Dana, that it was very much the same thing. It's like, you help to prepare, because you're going to turn the keys to the car up to her in September. I want her to have to be best positioned as possible. Dana's did the same thing for me, so that you have the continuity.
I'm just wondering, with only 7 people in the room, I wonder if some of that stuff is gonna happen organically because it's a smaller group anyway, with everybody. You know what I mean?
No, I don't think, if I may, I think in our current structure, having the 3-year preparation makes a lot of sense. I think going towards this, you could easily get rid of secretary treasurer.
Not legally.
Well, no, we're not talking about what's practical.
Law, I think, is a little different.
Well, no, the bylaws. I mean, yeah, you have to use life. But in talking about this system.
You're talking about Illinois law.
Yeah.
Oh,
Not the.
We're required to have
Like,
a
you'd have to
treasurer.
have that position, but it wouldn't be
yeah,
part
but it
of the
doesn't have to be
ladder.
elected. It doesn't have to be
Right, it would be
elected.
elected,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're bogging things down in the weeds.
Detail.
Your point, Robert.
But
Because that's what we do as
yeah.
a board. We like to be in the
Yeah.
weeds.
Yeah, but I
Keep
I
it
think
your
Scared if
aura.
we're not in the
Yeah.
weeds.
What these two have said, I think, is right, because a lot of what happens between the president-elect and the president isn't what happens at the meetings. It's what happens in between the meetings,
Yes.
and that's where the learning comes in. And I mean, if the decision is to continue to elect a president, you need to elect a president-elect.
So real quick comment, and Sue. So this question about the ladder and the president, who's in your eyes, who elects the president and the president-elect? Let's just say those two positions.
That's what I was asked too.
Who elects them?
Is that members?
Right.
or-
I like the idea of the board doing it.
Okay.
Once it's been selected, let's say if we do this and it's, let's say the 7 + 2, so 9. I like the idea of the board selecting.
Versus having that person run
Yeah,
as president
as
or
president.
president-elect. Right. And
That
that's
would-
the key
yeah.
question that we've been.
But why?
Well, because then you could potentially have, let's say, because if they just run for president and they don't get it because someone else gets it, then are they not able to be a board member at all? And then are we losing out on someone who potentially could be a really great board member, but just because they lost to maybe someone else as president? And I think we do see that now with some of our elections because of, like, with the region, there might be 2 great people in a region. I mean, the at-large, that happens all the time. There are great people that come out for it. Only one person can get it, So then they're completely eliminated versus if you're doing top votes out of, these top 50 people, then it could be chosen from there.
The other side of the coin is also true in some associations when a president is elected, but is elected on a platform of doing business entirely different than the board has been. It's what you're seeing in the GOP, right? So you get a president elected based on that, on the change platform, but if the rest of the board is not on board with that, then your association goes nowhere. So that's also a potential
Versus
pitfall.
if you elect 7 people and they all come in and everybody's on equal footing on day 1, and then they, go in a room and duke it out and figure out who's going to be.
And if the
But-
terms are staggered, then that would leave some people out of the ability to be president, right? Or be the president-elect. I should
Well,
say.
right. I guess
They'd have to have 2 years.
in that situation, you really would, that the group, like, let's say if we did this in September, there would be maybe 4 people. I know, but there'd be maybe 4 people on the slate that would join the board members of the other. Do the math.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
But there technically, if we did this, I think the president would already be selected. Really, what that new board coming in would pick is the president-elect.
If there's a ladder.
If you do that,
Perhaps.
yes.
2-person ladder.
Right, if you were to do that, right? Because you couldn't pick the president if we had a president-elect.
Right, gotcha.
So
Right,
you would be
right,
picking the eventual president, but it wouldn't be that
For the
same
next,
year.
for the
But-
following
and-
year.
Yes, but
If I'm
even if,
thinking that
so,
right, yeah.
You'd have to kind of have a split process too, because you'd have to have a slate of
yes, you would. You'd
1
have to
year
have-
versus 2 year, and it would be the pool of folks in that 2-year term. You would select the
So
president.
launching it's going to be a little sticky
It would be highly
Or-
unlikely, I think, that
or-
somebody who's just elected is chosen to be president by the rest of the board. It would be somebody who's already been on the board for a while.
Yeah, or, I mean, we could do a rather than a 1 and 2 year term on the board, if we were looking for more continuity and relationship building and so on and so forth, have a 2 year term and a 3 year term.
Again, that's a committee
Yeah,
thing. yeah.
committee thing, yeah, it's something to consider.
What I will say, I think I've heard though, because no one spoke up in the opposite, so if you feel differently, please do. The general consensus seems to be, it seems to make more sense that the board elect its own president and president-elect, right? So if that's the case, then I think what we're talking about here is a cultural thing within the board itself, not a structural thing. The structure is elect 7 plus 2. Well, elect 7, appoint 2. That's the structure. How the ladder within that moves, what positions they are, how they work. I think that's a cultural issue that can be defined later. Okay. Now, if the task force says no way in hell should the board select its own president, that needs to be left to the membership, then I think we have different dynamic. But I think it's important for the task force to vet the pros and cons of both of those. And I've always been a believer that when you talk through things, most reasonable people arrive at the same conclusions. And so as the task force works through that, I'll be curious to see where they end up on that notion. Of all the things we've talked about in terms of the governance, I think SPJ not electing its own president may be the largest shift, outwardly shift that people may struggle with so far that we've talked about.
I'm thinking through it. I think what you said made a lot of sense.
Thank you.
First time in 4 years.
All right. So we've seen.
But no, I'm not done yet.
Okay. I'm on a clock. People are going to get hungry soon.
But,
Yeah, really.
I don't know, there's just something about the membership picking its leader that, and I can't say why I think it's the right thing to do, but there's just something about it that in my core feels like the right thing to do.
They'd be picking potentially 7.
Leaders.
Yeah, plus two, I mean, and
Yeah.
knowing that one of
Yeah.
those leaders is going to run the organization someday.
Be any of them.
Yeah.
So you get you to pick 7.
I don't know if this
I
is
don't know,
why,
it's
Robert.
just, and maybe it's just because I'm an old fart, I don't.
Hey,
I
you know what?
question
Americans.
Whether it needs to be looked at pragmatically as well. What can pass?
Yeah, but that's not today's.
Not today.
Yeah, no pragmatic stuff.
I think-
They're just doing pie in the sky.
I think
that's
it's.
all.
I think it's American DNA.
Yeah.
You elect your president,
Yeah.
and it's SPJ DNA.
Yeah.
You elect your president, and I think that has a lot to do with a lot of reasons that associations don't go as far as they probably should.
It's almost like
But-
you have to
but-
look at all 7 candidates as potential presidents.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, and I acknowledge it's an emotional response. Everything you said is rational and logical and ought to carry the day, but emotionally,
Well, the House of Representatives picks the speaker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The president of the Senate pro tem is the old guy.
But it's traditionally, but it's not required.
Montgomery County, Maryland, they pick the sitting council members, pick the
Yeah.
president of the council. And I suspect it happens that way in a lot of other organizations as well.
County boards.
Andy has.
Oh yeah.
Just thinking things through, if you're talking about 7 people being elected and 2 being appointed, could one of the appointees end up being president? So that's somebody who was never elected.
I don't know. I mean, you could structure it so that it can or can't
Yeah.
happen.
I would think, I can't speak for everybody. I would think the folks who are elected by the vast body would be the ones who truly would want to put that kind of power in. The appointees are there to kind of even out representation more than anything. They have a vote, but they've not been freely elected, openly elected. And I think that open election is really critical.
Well, one of the things that could happen is that if your appointees, you find some people that bring diverse, using all of our different criteria up there, they are appointed by the board, they serve a term. If they're interested in being president, they stand for being one of the elected 7 positions of 7.
Right.
In which case, okay, you validated them right away, sure, they ought to be considered.
So here's why I would argue to the contrary. So here's a contrarian's point of view. If you appoint somebody, and of the 9 people in that room, they are clearly best suited to lead a group of people, keep the meetings focused, keep the things churning, and they are best at keeping the group moving forward in a strategic manner, why would you not have them be your president if they are the best qualified to do it?
I think the membership, I think, to be honest with you, we do have to be pragmatic on some fronts. And I think rightfully so, the membership would say, this was not who we elected to put into that. It's an appointed position.
Sure, but they're the best qualified.
Yeah, but Paul said they've got their opportunity. It's just
Yeah,
2
they
years
can run
down
the next
road.
year.
And I think, would someone who was appointed even want to be president? Because why didn't they maybe run in the first
Yeah.
place?
Well,
Maybe not.
I don't know.
I mean, this
Well,
this
maybe one of
is
the losers gets appointed.
yeah, that could happen too.
That's true.
That's right. The number 8 vote getter
The,
might be somebody they decide to appoint to the position.
the whole point and concept of a competency-based board is the best people are put in the best positions to succeed and remove all barriers to make that happen. The pragmatic approach is what do we feel comfortable with within that frame? So
What we're saying is representatives are not necessarily competent.
perhaps.
And sometimes people
Look
don't
at Congress.
realize the potential that they may have, and there may be circumstances that prevent them from doing that. They may come in with those skills, and life gets in the way too sometimes.
And there's
I've served on one or either of these boards for 19.5 years, and there are certainly elected representatives who are not competent, and there are elected representatives who are incredibly competent. It's just the nature of the game.
Right.
And I'm not mentioning any names.
okay, so we're gonna move on. It is noon, and my timeline says we're gonna wrap this up at 12:30. So Patty, what do you want from us?
So a timeline.
Yep.
In my mind, I think I would like to have the committee assembled by the convention and have them informed, right? So they will watch today's meeting, they will read the book, and we'll have a couple of Zoom sessions with you to understand our task, right? So that would be, yeah, I think that would be realistic. That's a lot to do actually between now and September. And then I would be open to suggestions on the timeline, but I think quicker is better. I think that we will lose momentum if we let it linger too long. So I would like our first task force report to be due by the spring board meeting. And I would like to try to do whatever is voted on that spring board meeting to be put into place at convention 2017. Yeah.
So
I think
somewhere in there, the
that's a year
bylaws
and
committee
and
would,
3 months.
the bylaws committee would do its thing.
We probably have to follow the spring
I think
board
the task
meeting, yeah.
force would say that the bylaws will need to be addressed in the following ways, but it will not do the work of that. So we would be passing the baton then to the
But in
bylaws.
anything that would have to be, what are the dates of the EIJ 17? September
7th, 9th.
17.
This year is
17.
Early
It's
September.
Yeah. I don't
Okay,
early
so
September of
The bylaws committee would have to have its work done by early July.
And
It's a
that
6
won't happen. Unless the bylaws committee starts earlier than that, doing this much, if you're talking about a major overhaul,
Yes.
then
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
not,
we would need more time than from April, at the end of April to early July.
gotcha, right.
It's a 60-day window for convention.
Could you have, for a task force for the January exec,
That's what I was gonna say, the
with
January exec might be
with the
first
April
one.
board meeting, sending it to bylaws? Would that give you enough time, Bob?
Well, if we know what they're asking for, then we can start looking at it before it gets to the board in
Yeah,
April.
and then do any
And then we would
adjustments
have
to
more-
respond.
I think like the ethics vote, this is going to take 2 conventions.
Well, I was kind of thinking about that, and I don't know. Obviously, this would not be ready for this convention to like fully put on the floor. But since we will have all the membership, like not all the membership, but a majority of the membership in one place, it would maybe be interesting to toss out some of the ideas and get feedback.
In
No, it's
terms
a
of
good
like
idea
a
to
resolution.
start to have
Yes.
conversation, but
Yeah.
it just, it's not even a majority of the membership.
Oh, that's yes, yeah.
But
But
if you hit people,
yeah, and
in-person
people who care.
conversations are great, there probably needs to be some other communication
Yeah.
things that.
I don't know if we
No,
could
I think
even do
you're
that.
right to at least start talking about it, because
Do you have-
if you talk about it for a year, then by next September.
And it's not a big surprise, and we're kind of a step ahead.
This is your first quote column.
Do you have,
Yeah.
do you have a slot at convention where you
That's
could
what
have a
You-
1 hour discussion?
Don't you have the president and president-elect
I-
meet with?
I could ask Scott if I can add another session.
No,
No,
no.
But don't you do the coffee with the leaders thing? That would be a place to do it.
and we could do it during closing business meetings. We could do it during the board meeting and say, hey, public, please come. The board's gonna be talking about this, and that's the focus of the agenda for that first board meeting. We could do that too.
Which
So-
first board meeting? The one
Her first?
on Wednesday?
Yeah.
No, like the opening. You're talking about the opening, right?
And that's what I'm talking about, your first board
Mine.
meeting,
Okay.
Could be.
Wednesday morning.
No, the first board meeting of convention is what you're talking about.
Or second, doesn't, a board meeting.
I know it would be interesting to do it during one of our, and I don't know if it would fit, because I know our business sessions are always so packed, but to have it, the conversation just kind of start then, even if it's just like an hour, hold it at an hour, hold it at 40 minutes. Tell
And
people
I
ahead of
think part
time.
of the prep would be, so the committee is formed, the committee gets educated,
Right.
and the committee decides what it can share at convention and in what ways it will invite wider membership participation in the conversation on it. All things TBA, but
Why don't we do this? How long is the business session?
90 minutes usually, the first one.
Opening,
No, closing.
closing is an hour and a half,
It's an hour and a half.
maybe 2 hours.
What if, Patty, you had a 20-minute presentation as part of that, and we'll dedicate 20 minutes to say, and that will be the handoff from me to you of where this is something that we started this summer, whose work will continue, and we'll really be getting underway at the close of EIJ 16. We want your thoughts, your input. Here's what we're putting on the table, and kind of orchestrate it if you did write your first call.
and this would be at the
That would-
closing business session
Correct.
potentially.
I kind of like that at the opening, because then it gives people an opportunity
You
to
guys
talk to
just let me
people
know,
while
like,
we're,
yeah,
and I don't know
at
logistically,
business.
but.
No,
since
no,
you're
no, I
right-
just was gonna throw an idea out, and I think Robert has one too, I don't know if they're the same.
And Bob does.
So, what if you trade out something you usually do for this, meaning that at the closing, you trade out doing resolutions, the time you dedicate to resolutions to something like this, that is pretty important.
I agree with, I'm fine with trading it out. I think it might be better to have it earlier instead of the closing. I don't know if we can do that. I don't know. if it
Because isn't
replaces
closing a
opening.
day without many programs, without many, sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Right,
It
so a
is.
lot of the regular folks have left by then, right? So
And it
earlier
gives-
is
All right,
better
let's
than
back
later.
up. The
Closing
opening
board
session
meeting.
is how long? Hour and a half?
Hour.
An hour.
An hour, and that's where we include candidate speeches.
Candidate speeches and
Here's the
chapter awards.
Schedule.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so we got
Do you have it memorized?
an hour
No, I
on
have
It's an
Oh.
hour,
Sunday. What time Sunday?
it's from 5 to 6.
Sunday afternoon.
It can go, sorry.
Okay,
it
for the candidate speeches, currently we don't have contested races for president-elect or secretary-treasurer. I'm inclined to think, I insisted when I was running unopposed for president-elect that I get to talk, because I think if you're gonna be the president, you need to at least present yourself.
I did not last year.
You did not. I think we could cut the secretary-treasurer speech. No apologies to Alex, but if we're trying to create a 20-minute slot where Patty can get up and say, this is what we've got in mind, this is what we're working on. Chapter awards, what do we have? We have best big, best small,
Yeah, circle of,
all the circle of excellence stuff.
and then the at-large, there are 4 candidates for that. There are 2
Well, that's going right
candidates
there.
for the campus advisor. There are 4 candidates for the student reps.
I mean,
It
I
can
I'd
go
follow,
longer.
I'd
I could
follow
just do
you.
it in
I mean,
12
we're looking to
minutes.
carve out time. I mean, I do not have to.
It
I'll
can-
say, this is Rebecca, she's running for president-elect, stand up, Rebecca, and say, hey. Okay, so we've cut those 2 speeches and saved 10 minutes right there, right?
It can go past an hour. There's nothing
I was
after
gonna say,
it.
because the opening reception is a
Well,
little
this,
later.
no, you got
Yeah.
the scripts thing. Shouldn't that be sacrosanct? That's a lot of folks.
That's
No.
at 6,
Forgot to move it to
That's
that night.
exactly 6, yeah.
starts at 6.
What's before it?
How long do
The
we give the
business
student
meeting.
reps to speak?
Oh, the
5 to
second.
6 business
Everybody
meetings,
gets
6 to
2
6.
minutes.
2 minutes, so
Three.
that's 8 minutes, transition of a minute between each, that's 12 minutes.
Keep it to 2.
Well, then I made everybody only do 2 that
No, Tara, 2 minutes is plenty.
Yeah.
Because some of them don't know how to tell time anyway.
Exactly.
2 minutes, and if you disobey the red card, you're disqualified.
The
Vetting committee will come after you.
I'll tell you what, let's make it happen. 20 minutes of the opening session. I'll spend 2 minutes introducing the idea and explaining why Patty's even getting up here to talk.
Can I just make certain we say no questions? This is not our point
Well,
of
that was,
discussion.
that was what I was gonna say.
'Cause you know-
That I'd like some clarification or some direction from this group on how people can join the discussion, right? Are we gonna have a site they can go to? Do we just wanna give
At a
my
different time.
email? I mean, this could really be contentious. We know that, right? If we're gonna be
I'd do a-
throwing out the
I'd do a
whole.
blog and not my email address.
What if we
Um,
did like a Google form? I think that's very important. Like if we're gonna do
Figuring out
this,
how we're going
the
to
idea is to-
solicit input
like,
and then
make
what we're
sure-
gonna do with it.
right, make sure it's clear who's kind of gonna be talking about this if you wanna talk to them, like, who the people are and how to get a hold of them and share your thoughts.
Let's here's an idea. So let's not get hung up on if it's gonna happen at the open or closing business meeting. Let us put our heads together. Like Chris brought up a good point. This isn't just for delegates. This is for membership at large. And I think a large part of people who come to those meetings are delegates only. So maybe we can create space within the convention schedule to have, which is not common for us, a membership meeting. And we talk about this specifically. And then in that meeting, maybe you can answer questions or not, but then we announce the Google form. We'll be collecting input from here on out. I'll be around over the next whatever, if you have time to talk to me. Can we try to work on?
Yeah, if you
seeing
guys can
that's
figure out the
feasible?
timing, that's great.
Instead of
And
the
I have,
business
like,
meetings?
Some other set.
I would prefer that,
Commitments
but
during
it's like
Sure.
your schedule is always so
I
tight.
don't
then-
care.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
and
Things
this,
like that.
it may be unpleasant. Like maybe it's an 8 o'clock meeting. Do we think 8 o'clock in the morning for a full membership meeting is better than cramming it into the business meeting? And those may be the decisions
If we're just
we have to make.
Yeah, I
but-
mean, if we're just looking to introduce the idea, I think it can be introduced at the opening session and then with more discussion kind of offline to follow.
Did we do the coffee leaders last year?
Yeah, but I was told that was the last time we were gonna do it. We just thought that saying it's a membership meeting sounded more
Yeah.
like everybody should come and get this
Right,
update
right,
on the
right. You don't
society.
have to have
It's
a
more
card to
about
get
it's,
in.
it's how it's packaged.
And
by
I
saying
think
it's a
this is a
membership meeting.
21st century decision. We're trying to move forward. This affects everybody
Yeah.
across the board. This is a huge change. And I think a membership meeting has a whole different ring to it anyway. It's inclusive, not
Yes, I
exclusive.
agree on that.
And I think my other suggestion is, and Patty, if you want to give up time, but there might be a place where Patty can kind of camp out. And if folks have questions or members of the committee, just to come and
I'm
kind
gonna
of
need
make
a
it
suite
fluid.
for that.
And a pool boy?
Whose name is Carlos.
Alcohol optional.
Right.
But I'm
Have a cocktail
thinking,
party, Patty.
yeah, you may get some of the usual folks who are very, opinionated, and rightfully
Right.
so. This is a
Right, right, right.
huge change.
Yeah.
But I think we
But
want
I can-
more openness in the freedom of
We'll have
discussion.
a committee, right, Andy? We'll have a committee to, back me up on that.
Yeah.
The,
You should not go it alone.
the two pitfalls of associations trying to make radical change are moving too fast, which generally leads to skepticism, and not being transparent. So
Yeah.
being open, moving slower, getting everybody on board is how you actually achieve success.
But
Not-
moving too slow is the death knell.
it's a happy medium.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a cautionary tale, which is one member, one vote. Hagit said at the beginning of her term that she wanted it to happen, and the bylaws committee began working on it. We and she, I don't think, knew that there was a subterranean campaign against it, and the board voted it down in April. The only reason it came to the floor was after that I recruited Andy and Mac McCarroll, who found 10 chapters to bring it to the floor. So you really have to prepare, you're dealing with the 23-member existing board
Right.
and its turf air
We
concerns.
could concurrently get rid of the
And
resolution
so
process.
you've got a hurdle even
Problem
before
solved.
you
Nobody
get
can
there.
bring it forward.
I would not complain. I don't think most people complain, yet we have
Yeah,
them.
that's good.
So
RTDNA doesn't.
I
do
do
anymore.
think that the current board, Kerensky's particular proposal went down in flames, but I saw and heard enough. I was watching all the faces on my computer on Zoom. I think there was enough interest in change of some kind, of doing something. I mean, I think everybody felt that what we have is kind of broken. Michael's fix wasn't the right answer for a variety of reasons, but that we had to do something, which is why we thought that we ought to have a committee that dug into it seriously. And you had said you wanted to serve. I said I didn't mention you earlier, and I apologize. So you were one of the people who said who should be on the task force.
Okay.
I don't know if that's one of Patty's questions, and I want to take her time, but I do think that's something we should talk briefly about, whether it's now or over lunch, but is the makeup of that group. Like what are the types of people we want? And I think we don't have to decide on the names now. If we want to put them out, we can. But I think we could approach it the same way we approached the January strategic planning session, which is, what voices, what types of representation do we want? And then let's brainstorm. And Patty and I can do that offline. And then maybe once we come up with a list of people, we can have it vetted by, you two or whoever, to kind of finish off that, who that task force will be made up of. And you guys can sign off on it. Does that work for you, Patty?
There was one of the outside voices at the Scottsdale strategic planning. I thought if he would be willing, would be really good on this, because I think he's a forward thinker. He's creative.
Okay.
Is that Sam?
We're not I don't want to mention names while we're starting. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can do that. And the idea I had was, and I don't know anyone in particular, but I like the idea of having maybe one of the ambassadors that recently came forward, because they have almost no involvement with SPJ. I think it's important to get the viewpoint of the member who has no care in the world about how this organization is run.
Probably doesn't even know what the situation is right now.
Which I think common sense will tell you is the majority of the membership. They don't-
True.
they don't care.
Okay, before,
Yeah,
so we've
yeah.
answered the when, we have a rough timeline. The who is going to be determined. We have some names and some possibilities, but really the what. I need some perimeters that we are looking at only SPJ board composition and the process by which to achieve that structure. And we are not looking at delegates or regional. We're going to not try to do all that at the same time. Okay.
Correct.
But those would be terrific first agenda items for a newly composed board, right?
Sure would.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
All right, that's good. That's
There's a
good.
plot here, isn't there?
There's not a plot. There's a step.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
steps.
there's a step.
I mean, one will happen probably smarter, better, and maybe things we haven't even thought of could come out of new ideas that we haven't thought of.
I
So-
think there's a whole lot that this will trigger. This
Yeah.
will be the first of many changes, and I think that's going to be a key thing to communicate in September, that this is not just an isolated step. It's going to reshape the structure, right?
Yep.
Am I thinking too much on that?
This
But
will
I
help
mean,
you.
You're
The
thinking big,
working
which you
working
should.
That's
committees are
exactly
going to be
right.
different. We're going to have different kind of task force. The current lineup of our chapters, our regions, our committees, et cetera, is all in play, I think, with a strategic board looking at whether those are achieving what we want to achieve as SPJ.
Are you ready to get down into those weeds of the task forces
I
and the
don't
committees?
think
and-
so. I think we're going to
Yeah, I
say that,
think not.
these are the, I don't know.
Well, but you will need, I think, an answer to that, because I think those are gonna be where a lot of the questions come
absolutely.
from. Like, well, what does that mean if we get rid of a regional director? Who does my chapter report to? Who does all that? So we might wanna kind of think a little bit.
And the
To make
answer
sure
might be that
the-
we don't know yet.
Yeah, but I
And
think
that a new
think
board is
We
going to
need
look
some
at
kind of
all those
answer, though,
topics.
because
If the-
otherwise
if the
people will
answer
be
is-
really
if
scared.
the answer is we don't know yet, this thing will fail.
You think?
Yeah,
If you're
gonna
removing
need-
those board positions,
Well, I don't
and
know
you're
how
not
much
providing
a
the
task
explanation
force,
of how it's
okay,
gonna
I'm
work.
gonna say, I don't know how much a task force of 4 or 5 people can answer all those questions independent of all of this, right? So
Well-
by its very nature,
but I-
it's just recommending a plan of action.
Yeah, I'm not saying you do it, but I
without-
think we
yeah.
need to come up with what you're going to say when those come up as a board. And I'm wondering, and I don't know if Joe and Tara, maybe you can help with this. Because let's say this passes and we have, these board members that are not based on a region. The chapters then would just report to you, Tara, which is kind of what they do now, right? Okay. So what, well, so what is being, I guess, so what would be, the concerns would be, well, what about a regional conference? And I guess maybe we could say, well, that would be determined by chapter leaders or people in the area. That kind of stuff will change, but that would be determined at more of a local level with help from maybe staff. I don't know if that's a good answer, but we need to kind of.
Well, again, I think there are other proposals like what I had recommended. I mean, that's just one idea. I'm sure there are others out there. You have like a state coordinator and a regional director, and you have, we eliminated the position, but there's some way to have
To
the
become a
regional.
regional coordinator.
Yeah, I mean, I still think you need some local, not local chapters, but just a representative who
But I don't
takes
think
that
this task
away.
force
No.
is gonna get into any.
No,
of
and
that,
I don't think
right?
this is the time
And
or the
so-
place.
So
Yeah,
does she
except if
But
you
in
look-
September,
say
but
staff
those
is
questions
gonna-
will,
Yeah.
those
You're gonna
questions
have
will
to-
flow.
You're gonna have to sell the bylaws amendment that the membership, well, the delegates are gonna vote on at the convention next year.
I really think you need to have something firm about what happens with the regions if you want
staff,
this to pass.
could we say staff?
And,
Would that be?
I see nothing wrong with continuing to have regional directors of 12 or 20 or 10
Yeah.
or whatever number of regions who aren't members of this board.
I
And
do
just
too.
a committee
I
under the
don't think
board.
you have to
Yeah,
break that all up.
because I
I
think
don't know that it's broken.
those folks are gonna want to have that reassurance that the way they do things with their regional contest or whatever is going to survive this change. If they have any question about it, if there's any doubt, this fails.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I do think that's true.
So some of these questions that you all have, the task force members who are not here will have them. And as members talk to us in different ways, they will have questions. Many of those questions you've already proposed are in this book. It's eerie how they say, well, what about this? What about this? And the verbiage is different and the terminology is different. But it is true. You do have to be prepared to answer questions, and you do have to be prepared if we're changing this or taking this away or altering this. What are some possible outcomes? What are some possible solutions? Exactly what are we going to do? That's a proposal. That's different, right? So I do think it's important that as you're working through this and as the task force works, these questions are going to come up because I've already had them and I've been working through them. And Tara and I have talked about them. Chris and I have talked about them. So your task force will too. And it's arriving at the conclusions to those questions is how you arrive at the answers when people ask you, because that's how I've been able to answer your questions.
Right.
So it will happen
But-
through the national
And
educational
it's
process.
gonna be, it's gonna be contentious, I understand that, and not that much will be known by September when we get in front of whoever's interested and
Right.
throw this out. So, the option is just stay mum and don't say anything and just spring it on people, which I don't think is advisable. Or, face the fire that might come at you and say, we know that's an issue that we will have to look at, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, no,
We know that's an
yeah.
issue, we know that's an
Yeah.
issue, thank you for your,
Yeah.
right?
I don't
So-
think you need to have the regional questions by this September, but by the year.
Oh,
from
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Yeah.
By April, when you go to the
Yeah.
board, you're gonna need to be able to answer those questions.
I'm just wondering, is a person who's now a regional director going to be willing to be a regional coordinator or whatever we decide to call it, if they don't have a vote on the board?
Or a stipend to travel.
Ooh.
Why do they need a
Well, they
second
could
to
still
travel?
get
Well,
a
they won't
stipend
have
to
to-
travel within their region.
Yeah,
but
we ought to be able to,
It might be adjusted
I-
if they're not coming to
I
board.
actually think Robert may have the answer to what it's going to be one of our biggest concerns about this. If we keep the regional coordinator structure, and it's a position that people run for, because it might, think years down, how are you going to establish a track record to run for the board? I spent 5 years as regional coordinator in Region 6, and I did this, and this for my group. And that's why I love SPJ and why I want to continue to serve and go on the board. And the only thing it's going to do is going to create an additional layer of elections for you, which,
I think
Well,
that's
those
big.
elections are already happening.
yeah,
Still do it at national, at the regional meeting.
understand.
I-
Understand, but I think that you have solved one of the bigger concerns, and it's also going to be the gut check of, oh my God, how can you get rid of regional directors? We aren't. We
I
aren't.
would
But
really,
the only thing that I react to with what you just said is I don't know that somebody who has, for what you're looking for the new national board, regional experience isn't necessarily the experience you want coming onto it.
Understand, but
Yeah.
we are gonna be electing these 7
Yeah.
people. I
Yeah.
mean, and,
Yeah.
you know, how are they
Yeah.
going to build a
Oh,
record?
you go ahead. I would really encourage leadership to think about not creating a second layer of governance. That's tinkering.
The regional coordinator, you're calling it a layer of governance?
I am.
How is it a layer of governance?
Because there's an election. Somebody has to plan the election. Somebody has to manage the election. Somebody has to collect bios. Somebody has to collect information. Those people will have power to determine where the conference is held. It's awards. I don't think there's anything wrong with having an individual within a region that helps do things. Don't get me wrong. But creating a formal structure on how these people will be
They can be
chosen and
appointed.
elected, I would really encourage you to move away from that.
I could even see, I mean, at the regional meetings, at convention, who wants to be the regional coordinator for this year? I'll step up, sure.
And just have the chapters handle
Just
that,
like,
you know,
without a formal,
as if,
one member type vote, yeah.
Well, if that's the case, I mean,
Yeah, I do think you're maybe making it too complicated. I think but I think there needs to be some, I'm just saying that however it's done, I mean, I think we are getting into the weeds now of how it's done. I think you just need to have something that calms fears about chapters.
well, that's
and I think
ultimately
I
the
think
point.
that's actually the biggest question that will come in
Mhm.
this coming
Yeah.
September is
Yeah.
what about the role of the
Yeah.
region, what now exists as a regional director when we lose those 12 bodies as board representation, you know, where do they live, right?
I think
Do they live?
I think we get mixed reviews. Some people will say, yeah, our regional director has been incredibly helpful for us. And others will say, I haven't heard from my regional director in 2 years. I don't care. It doesn't matter.
Which may change where it's more of a, not a board thing where we have to find somebody to fill it, but just captains getting together and say, we're going to make sure that we communicate, or I don't know if Region 10 still has their contest and, you know, handles that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they do. Okay. I mean, so they need somebody to do that.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Mark of excellence too.
Yeah.
That's
right.
huge.
Yeah.
And in every
Yeah,
respect.
yeah.
But by the same token, if we have a little more flexibility,
Yeah.
we can kind of,
Yeah.
we can work out
Where
the
it's not a
details.
2-year term and having to go to national
Okay.
meetings. And, yeah.
So Andy wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think we did a few things. One is we talk about function. We're focusing too much on this position of regional director. It's always been there. How do we keep it? We decide, does there need to be a regional director? What's the purpose of it? And our purpose, I think it's a good thing. Maybe Tara had some thoughts about that. Does she want to be handling chapters directly? It's good to have this local conduit, but it doesn't have to be an elected position. We have important positions within the society, committee chairs, or however, you know, we just find a way to put them in there. But we do have to answer that question because we can't just take it all away and say that doesn't exist. Just as a smaller note, I'm probably about 25 comments behind on this, but I would encourage us not to think of a way to eliminate speeches of people who are running, even if they're running uncontested. I do not want to vote for a president-elect who I've never heard from. And I'm not saying this is not directed at anybody in particular and that they didn't campaign, but this is the one time we do hear from them. Okay. We need to hear from them. So I had other things, so.
Save those for lunch. Tara, did you want to make a comment? And then Patty, did you have anything else left on your list? We'll hit after Tara makes her quick comment.
No, I think
Oh, you got?
feeling,
Feeling good?
oh, great.
It's made
Hey,
it-
kids, that
She's
family
not thinking about her foot
vacation we were
anymore.
gonna take in August, sorry, I'm busy.
We'll chat. You and I'll chat off. All right. What else? Anything else on governance, overarching radical changes? We didn't talk about the delegate system really. We didn't talk about culture much. We didn't talk about anything else that may have been in the memos. We really focused on the board structure, which I think was kind of the sentiment of the national board and why Patty's task force was created. So, you know, we can continue to talk over lunch. It's 12:30 now. We do have business that needs to be conducted later. So, any last words for the good of the order before I tell Paul I think I'm officially done? Did I forget anything, Chris?
You're perfect.
Tara, did I forget anything? Abby, did I forget
Glorious.
anything? Anyone, did I forget anything? All right, so I have copies of this book for all of you. And I'm pretty sure, well, those on the West Coast can read it on the way home. And probably be done by the time you land if you can stay awake.
It's
Kind
an
of
easy read.
take another read. It is very easy. What I will tell you is the first 3 chapters of this book focuses on what we talked about today. the other chapters talk about there's 5 steps to radically changing your organization for optimum performance. There's I think 5 or 6. We talked about number one. And as you will learn, you're right on track. The first rule of business is reshape your board, because if you don't, the rest of these things can't happen. So we're on step 1 of what this book says we should be doing. But what I also tell you is, because I always say, well, it's one book, right? This book coincides with the other books that I've read. This one is the one that those spoke most closely to, I think, what we're grappling with and what we're dealing with as an association. So it's kind of a combination of a lot of stuff that I've been reading. So I would encourage you to read it. I really would. And you'll get to the part about committees and empowering and training staff and that stuff. And that may be something we get to way down the road, not before Convention 17, but it's good to see it holistically, I think. But really pay attention to the first 3 chapters.
I just want to say thank you for your leadership on this.
You're welcome.
It does
Thank you.
seem like this is one of those perfect storm moments that you were, expanding your own knowledge about all of this. You were writing those memos in your head for a long number of months.
Yep.
And then Michael Kretsky stepped up with his proposal, brought the issue back to the table. So it does seem like this is the moment. So.
For those of you who are parents, you'll appreciate this. When I was telling them, I go to these quarterly training sessions with other executive directors, and so I've been telling them about this and the things I've been learning and the challenges I see with SPJ and the hurdles and the reason that it's held back sometimes. And so I've been researching this idea for several months, and my plan was to talk to Lynn about it. And I started a little bit. I think I asked you when you came to meet about the budget several years ago. I was like, you ever see a day where the board does this, or we don't have a convention, or really like throwing some big stuff out there?
And I said yes.
And she said yes. And I said, she's the president, that we will start talking about this stuff. This is when this will happen. And so I've been doing research in preparation for Lynn's term, and then Michael's proposal came about.
Okay, so Koretsky was a plant, wasn't he?
No, actually,
That
no.
changes.
Yeah.
The veil.
And I
We
talked
see the
about
plot. We
Yes.
see the various plots.
It's a long story
Where was
short.
she from before San Diego?
So when I told my peers about what was happening, they said it's like potty training. Like if they're showing signs of being ready, you got to go. So thank you
Taking
for
off the diapers.
thank you for indulging. Thank you for considering. Thank you for taking it seriously. I firmly believe that a change in procedure at the top, a change in the structure, will give way to things that we've never even thought of, dreamed of, considered. So I think the future of SPJ I think this could be the most important decision this organization has made in a long time, if not ever. I think can't be understated.
I would echo the thanks to you for doing this, and Patty, especially thank you for taking on the leadership of this project, because I think,
It's in good hands.
that this is, this is one of the things I certainly wasn't going to start in my term, but it's one of those where it kind of came together. So that, again, perfect storm is a nice way to describe it.
Well, and you also, with the focus on membership, it's all so interrelated. That I don't think we can take some major steps on our membership issues until we've got a board that can focus on that. Yeah, anyway.
Well, I
good.
thank all of you for your thoughtfulness and participation, because to me, this year, we have done the board meetings like I hope we would be doing board meetings on into the future. And that is actually talking about bigger picture things and doing and taking a longer view than just, changing oars and just getting into a lot of minutia. That's the best use of our time and talent. So we will adjourn, or I entertain a motion to adjourn for lunch.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we will adjourn for lunch, and we'll be back, what time, Joe, 1:30?
About an hour.
Yeah, 1:30 back here, and we have a little bit of business to do, then we'll go into executive session to consider the awards nominations. So,
Can I also just say, these are really great.
They are
This is
cool.
my first
These
time
are
seeing them.
awesome.
These are really great.
Where do we order them?
Emailing. No, we did
Very
those
cool.
for the after deadline things.
Oh.
So all of the volunteers got a package with EIJ brochures, those, and then
Oh.
I saw
Nice.
those.
Are those available too?
They're stickers. I
They're
have some
extras?
here.
Got a couple here.
I
I'll
wouldn't
take one.
mind one,
That's,
along with
that's,
our.
that's the sort of thing like
Yeah, yeah,
on
yeah.
the board that hire.
The
like,
other
you walk
sticker
in and
that's
you
over
see
here
them and you're
is
like,
what
oh,
the
that's really cool. You guys are
associates
doing
now
that.
get.
But like, you
Oh,
don't know
okay.
about it ahead of time,
And
right?
it's
You know?
a shield.
I like
Okay.
that.
Hey, Lynn?
Is it
Do you know
Thank you.
when the executive meeting in January is? Have you picked a date for that yet? Because I mean,
Should I be selfish and
I'm having to
Thank you,
plan.
Sharon.
One or the
Oh,
other,
no,
Tara,
no,
as
I
opposed to
don't-
taking both?
It doesn't matter to me. I brought a handful, but if somebody needs
Can
some, I
send
can
you
send
some.
some.
That's okay.
But the coasters are genius, I mean.
Yeah.
Now there's only two of us
SPJ and-
editors now.
and drinks,
because
I mean,
one
they
of
kind of
us
go
signed
together
and
thinking.
the
She
other
threw out on the
retired, so-
reception tables last
But
night
if
too.
you send
Oh,
me-
So-
I didn't.
No, you're talking or not at a table, but it was, I thought it was a good thing
Yeah.
to have
Okay.
available.
So send me